Hello and welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, Bob Kendrick. Bob was named president of the museum in March of 2011, an appointment which marked a celebrated return to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. He became the museum's first director of marketing in 1998 and was named vice president of marketing in 2009 before accepting the post as executive director of the National Sports Center for the Disabled Kansas City. Prior to his departure, Bob's leadership helped secure more than $15 million in financial support for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and widespread national acclaim. Bob began his association with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as a volunteer during his 10-year newspaper career with the Kansas City Star. As senior copywriter for the Star's promotions department, he won or was part of a creative team that won numerous local and regional advertising and marketing awards. He developed the advertising concept and campaign that helped attract more than 10,000 people in less than 30 days to see the debut of the museum's first traveling exhibit in the summer of 1993. The success of that promotion led to an appointment to the museum's board of directors in the fall of 1993. In his nearly 5 years on the museum's board, Bob served as secretary and treasurer and chaired the membership and event planning committees. He was co-chairman of the museum's grand opening gala celebration, which attracted more than 1,700 people to Bartle Hall in November of 1997, an event which raised more than $300,000 for the museum. Bob's volunteer roots in the Kansas City community are deep and passionate. He has served on the boards of various Kansas City area nonprofit organizations and has worked with Kansas City youth for more than 20 years. He remains active in the community and spends a great deal of time in Kansas City classrooms giving motivational talks to area students and sharing the illustrious history of Negro Leagues baseball with nearly 100 schools, social, and civic groups annually. Bob was inducted into the Missouri Sports Hall of Fame as a part of the class of 2014 as a sports administrator, and while he doesn't fashion himself to be a historian, Bob has become one of the leading authorities on the topic of Negro Leagues baseball history and its connection to issues relating to sports, race, and diversity. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is a privately funded museum dedicated to preserving the history of Negro League baseball in America. It was founded in 1990 in Kansas City, Missouri, in the historic 18th and Vine District, the hub of African American cultural activity in Kansas City during the first half of the 20th century. The museum operates 2 blocks from the Paseo YMCA, where Andrew Rube Foster established the Negro National League in 1920. And I've known since before Bob and I recorded this interview that this would be our February episode. Not because February is Black History Month, but because February 13th, 1920 is the date Rube Foster held that meeting at the Paseo YMCA to officially begin his Negro National League. And of the many times over the years which I have visited the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, my absolute favorite experience was on February 13th, 2020, the 100th anniversary of the league's formation. That night, friend of the show Greg Kreinler had the grand opening of his Black Baseball in Living Color exhibit, which featured more than 200 hand-painted portraits. Greg spent 3 years researching the players, finding their photos, and hand-painting the portraits in preparation for the event, which is also where I finally met José Tellier in person for the first time. The 3 of us had a great time in Kansas City, getting barbecue at Gates, getting milkshakes at Winstead's, and of course, spending hours inside the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. The museum was originally founded by a group of 5 men, which included Kansas City Monarchs outfielder Alfred Slick Surratt, Monarchs first baseman and manager John Buck O'Neill, founder of the Black Archives of Mid-America Horace M. Peterson III, and friends of the show, researchers, historians, and authors Larry Lester and Phil S. Dixon. The museum opened its doors to the public in a tiny one-room office space in 1991 with the dream of building a permanent facility that would pay rightful tribute to America's unsung baseball heroes. It moved from that single room inside the Lincoln Building to a 2,000 square foot space in 1994, before finally realizing their original dream in November of 1997 when the museum moved again, this time to its new 10,000 square foot home inside a cultural complex known as the Museums at 18th and Vine. That was done under the leadership of its late chairman, Buck O'Neill. The museum was actually on the verge of financial collapse in 2008 before rebounding with stronger leadership and greater engagement with the community. Bob Kendrick took over as president in 2011 and immediately proved his worth. 2012 was the museum's best year financially since 2007, and on November 13, 2012, the family of Buck O'Neill donated 2 items to the museum in honor of what would have been Buck's 101st birthday. his Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded posthumously by President George W. Bush, as well as a miniature replica of the Buck O'Neil statue at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum chronologically charts the progress of the Negro Leagues with informative placards and interactive exhibits. Its walls are lined with pictures of players, owners, and officials of Negro League Baseball from the Negro National League of 1920 through the Negro American League, which lasted until 1962. But the history they share at the museum dates back much earlier than that. If you want to see the museum for yourself, there is no wrong time to plan your trip to Kansas City. But the month of February provides you with a really special opportunity. In 2026, for what is now the 5th consecutive year, the Kansas City Royals Foundation is making admission to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum completely free to all who visit during the month of February. The Kansas City Royals began this tradition as a way to honor Black History Month in February and drive supporters to the museum, and it's grown in support every year since. The initiative is just one of several that the Royals do to support the museum throughout the calendar year. If you're lucky, when you visit, you'll have a chance to hear Bob Kendrick talk. But if you're not that lucky when you plan your own trip, I got Bob to share some great stories with us here today. And trust me when I say, in this episode, we cover lots of ground. Bob tells us stories about each and every person who is honored with a statue inside the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, from the individuals featured on their powerful field of legends to the couple who are featured elsewhere. We find out about some of the lesser-known Negro League players, whose names may not be as familiar to the masses as Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, or Cool Papa Bell, but are absolutely still worth knowing. We learn which white Canadian rocker has donated and dedicated 400 Negro League autographed baseballs to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And we hear about the hardest speech Bob Kendrick has ever had to deliver in his life. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. If you're new to the show, don't worry. You'll still be able to enjoy this episode without the extra help from the liner notes. But longtime listeners love the photos and links we put up on the website, which will give you a better understanding of the things Bob and I are discussing and provide some context when needed. The liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Bob Kendrick episode listed first on the main page under latest episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't need to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our earlier interviews, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of our 4 previous seasons and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened. I'll also explain how you'll have a couple chances to answer a trivia question to win a prize, so stick around until the end of the episode for that too. By the end of this episode, if you're still craving more Negro League stories from Bob, I highly recommend checking out his amazing podcast, Black Diamonds, which highlights the players, people, and events which shape the Negro Leagues. But now, here's my interview with the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, Bob Kendrick. You were born in Crawfordville, Georgia, a small town about halfway between Atlanta and Augusta. And as would have been the case in many small towns in the South at that time, your family faced racial segregation. Tell me a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Crawfordville.
For me as a kid, because I'm the youngest of 6 boys, and so by the time I come along, it's a relatively very carefree, unassuming childhood. You didn't realize that you were poor because everybody around you had the same thing that you had. Mm-hmm. When it's all said and done, nothing. But we never missed a meal. And so I really enjoyed my childhood because, again, it was so carefree. You could roam around, and in a town of 500 people, you really couldn't get in any trouble, and everybody had jurisdiction over you anyway. So there was no incentive to get in trouble because you go get a whipping from the neighbors, and then when you got home, because your mother and father embarrassed, you go get another whipping.
Right.
So, you just... I really enjoyed it. I don't think I would change my childhood for anything. And like I said, it was only after I got to college that I realized, whoa, wait a minute. We didn't have very much in comparison to what I'm seeing now that I'm in school, with people got their own cars, they're living in apartments, and they've got these means that I didn't necessarily have, but I had a great childhood. I had two very loving parents who maybe I didn't have everything I wanted, but I had everything that I needed.
Yeah. You received a basketball scholarship to attend Park College in Parkville, Missouri in 1980. When did you learn about Cumberland Posey for the first time, who is the principal owner of the Homestead Grays? And tell everyone listening why I just asked that question.
Yeah, because Cumberland Posey is in two sports halls of fame, major sports halls of fame. He's in the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. I didn't learn about Cum Posey until I started really working for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Now, I started volunteering for the museum in 1993, but it was years after I finished my volunteer role and became an official here that I learned about the exploits of Cumberland Posey, which I'm still not sure that there are a lot of people who understand that this man is in two major sports halls of fame. As a former basketball player, which I still love the sport. I don't play anymore. I just try to play golf these days. It hurt too bad to play basketball. I found that to be extraordinary and tremendously fascinating what Cumberland Posey was able to accomplish in both sports.
You were initially dreaming about a basketball career, but those aspirations ended when you broke your foot during your freshman year. What emotions were you going through at that time? You'd made your way out of Crawfordville. You've got this bright future ahead of you, and then boom, one bad break, and now everything's up in the air.
Well, and honestly, I think that dream of playing professional basketball had ended even before I broke my foot. I think I was very excited to be able to extend my high school playing basketball career into a college opportunity. But, I was about the size that I am now in the 8th grade.
Okay.
And I thought for sure that I was going to be 6'4", 6'5", and and then I didn't grow another inch after that. So I think the realization of an NBA career had kind of been dashed long before I broke my foot. But I was, just thrilled to be able to continue to play basketball because I always loved the game. And to get there and get my education paid for through basketball was just something that I was very proud of. When I broke my foot, I think I realized then that it was time to just focus on school, focus on what might be my other career. Because I knew at that point in time the NBA was not in my future. And so, just wanted to focus on getting out of school and kind of hone in on what you thought you might want to do for your career.
Yeah, so after that, you turned your focus to broadcast journalism. You earned your BA in Communication Arts. You had a 10-year newspaper career with the Kansas City Star, and I know it was during your time there when your association began with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as a volunteer, but is that really when you first became acutely aware of the Negro Leagues and their history and deeply interested in these players, these teams, their stories?
It's amazing how little I knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
And through no fault of your own. Like, where would you have found out about this stuff?
Exactly. I knew the names Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson.
Yeah.
Because they are transcending names.
Yes.
Most baseball fans have at least heard those names. Now, you may not know how great they were, but you've likely heard their names in some level of baseball conversation.
Yeah.
And that was the case for me. It was only after I got involved with this museum that I really started to understand the breadth, the depth, the scope, the magnitude that this history represented both on and off the field. And I think the minute that I walked into what was then a one-room office here at historic 18th and Vine, 3rd floor of the Lincoln Building. And when I walked into that one-room office, I literally walked into what would become my passion.
Yeah.
I fell in love with the museum, its mission, and I fell in love with the amazing athletes who made this story. And again, as a baseball fan, I quickly realized that I knew so little about the history of this game and its connections to the history of this country. I guess you could say I became engrossed in it.
Yeah.
I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I did not want to keep it to myself. I wanted everybody else to feel the same way that I felt about it. And then I started to meet the players. And of course, one particular player, the legendary Buck O'Neil. And as I've oftentimes said, once you're bitten by the Buck bug, oh man, it's a wrap. I just wanted to be on Buck's team. I wanted to assist and help him in any way that I could because I was no different than everybody else who met Buck for the first time. It was love at first sight. I had no idea that it was going to turn into a career. And honestly, one of the most gratifying things I think I could have ever done, either personally or professionally, because any time that you do work that you know is bigger than you are, it's very rewarding.
Yes.
It is tremendously gratifying. We talk about this collectively as a team here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, that if we do this right, we will leave a legacy. We will leave something that will stand the test of time that others will have an opportunity to enjoy for generations to come. And that's, I think, not only motivated me, but it motivates our entire team. And I never saw that coming. I didn't realize that there was a career in hand. And it has been an amazing journey to go from being a volunteer to now trying to lead what I believe is one of the most important cultural institutions in the world. Yeah, no, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is one of this country's preeminent social justice, civil rights institutions. It's just seen through the lens of baseball. But as I remind folks, more importantly, it is triumph over that adversity. And so it has been an amazing experience, an improbable journey that I had no idea that I was about to embark on until I walked in that room. I don't even know if I knew it when I walked in that room. Like I said, I just wanted to be there to support this institution any way that I could. And here we are 32 years later. It's been a 32-year affiliation with this great museum.
Yeah. Andy Warhol once had a quote, "The goal isn't to live forever. The goal is to create something that will."
Absolutely.
Yeah. You developed the advertising concept and campaign that helped attract more than 10,000 people in less than 30 days to see the debut of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum's first traveling exhibit in the summer of '93. How often does the museum do traveling exhibits now? Because whenever I tell people about your museum, I frequently have them tell me the first time they heard of it was when they saw one of these traveling exhibits. So how often do those happen?
Well, we created Discover Greatness in 1993, and that began my involvement because I was the senior copywriter in the Kansas City Star's promotions department, which functioned as the Star's in-house advertising agency. And so we would do a lot of promotional campaigns to help support nonprofit organizations by providing print space for them to basically promote the events and fundraising activities that they had. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time in 1993 when the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum was given promotional space, and my boss came to me and said, "I think I got a project that you would enjoy." And I dreamt up the campaign that drew those 10,000 people to come see an exhibition called Discover Greatness. It is still touring the country 32 years later. And the success that we had is what prompted the officials here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to ask if I would consider joining their board of directors, which I jumped at the opportunity. That was a volunteer role, and that started my volunteerism here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. That was in the summer of 1993. That was in August of 1993 that we debuted this exhibit here at Historic 18th and Vine, and it got a tremendous response because at that time there was virtually nothing here at 18th and Vine. And so there was obviously some trepidation by a lot of folks on the viability of whether a museum could succeed in this area. And thanks to the wisdom, the infinite wisdom of the late, great Buck O'Neil, who said, "This is where we will build this museum. And in doing so, we will help resurrect what had been once a very proud, prominent African-American community during that era of American segregation." We haven't looked back since. That was in 1990 when the museum was established here. Today, we are recognized as America's national Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as deemed and designated so by the United States Congress. And of course, we're welcoming thousands of people each and every year to experience this museum, and of course, on the cusp of building a brand new 30-plus thousand square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here in the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District It'll be built, of course, right there next to the former Purcell YMCA, soon to become the Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center. And, of course, as you know, it was in that YMCA building that Andrew Rube Foster established the Negro Leagues. And so I guess you could say that we're going full circle right back to the very building that gave birth to the story that we're now charged with preserving, to save that historic landmark and then build the brand new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum essentially attached to it, that historic landmark where it all began. So I am super excited to be building what I call the nation's first Negro Leagues campus as the gateway in to historic 18th and Vine.
Yeah, that's amazing. You announced these plans in May of 2023,
and
here we are in July now.
Man, of 2020. Time is flying by. Time is flying. July of 2025, and this project has grown in scale and scope. We recently announced the addition of a Marriott Tribute Hotel.
Yeah, 7 floors, right?
That's going to be built into the new museum. Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson is part of the hotel development team, and of course his father played in the Negro Leagues.
Yes.
His father, Martinez Jackson, played for the Newark Eagles. He also drove the bus, and he was the team's traveling secretary. And so it's a legacy moment for Reggie to be a part of this campus that we're developing that will be really this tribute to Black baseball and social history.
That's great. It's a struggle to accurately and appropriately tell the story of Black baseball in America, even in a fully functioning museum, because there's just so much history and background to cover just to explain why the Negro Leagues existed in the first place. I think most people listening to this podcast are already aware of why the Negro Leagues existed, but it's important to me to talk about some of the great players and people who made the Negro Leagues what they were. Mm-hmm. There are thousands of players in Negro League history, so we won't have time to cover all of them in this episode, but I think your museum has already picked out a great selection of the most significant and influential people for me in the field of legends, where visitors can walk onto a baseball diamond adorned by life-size bronze statues of 13 larger-than-life figures in Negro League history. A handful of them are going to be names everyone has heard of and potentially even know some stories or statistics related to them. But I know we're going to say some names today that people will be hearing for the first time, and hopefully this sparks an interest in our listeners to go out and learn not only more about the people we talk about today, but many of the other great Black baseball players from throughout history as well. So if you don't mind, I'd love to just go down the list of the statues with you and have you tell me some stories about each of the people who were so honored in your museum. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. Okay, so let's start with Rube Foster, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1981, becoming the first representative of the Negro Leagues elected as a pioneer or executive. There very well could have been a statue of Andrew Rube Foster, the pitcher, instead of the owner. Before we get into his contributions as an executive, tell me a little bit about the player.
Yeah, Rube Foster, in my own opinion, is the most brilliant baseball mind this sport has ever seen. And virtually no one knows who the heck he is, even though he is rightfully enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yes.
But you're right, he is the rarest of baseball figures who would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a player, as a manager, and as an executive. Mm-hmm. And you don't find many, if any, that check all 3 boxes.
Right.
He had been a great pitcher himself in the early era of Black baseball. As a matter of fact, he is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball.
Right.
And he dominated everybody. Now, then that pitch was called a fadeaway, and he perfected that pitch. He dominated all competition, black and white, with his fadeaway.
Mm-hmm. There's stories that Giants manager John McGraw snuck
Absolutely.
Rube into their camp so he could teach Christy Mathewson how to throw that pitch.
And it is a true story that he did indeed sneak Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Mathewson how to throw the screwball. Mm-hmm. Christy Mathewson threw the pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster. So Foster was a tremendous athlete, a tremendous pitcher, and he dominated all levels of competition in that early era of Black baseball.
How did he go from Andrew Foster to Rube? Where did he get that name?
He earned the nickname Rube when he beat the great major leaguer Rube Waddell in a head-to-head matchup. They nicknamed him Rube, and the nickname stuck.
I've heard you say that, in your opinion, the Homestead Grays, the Kansas City Monarchs, and Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants are the 3 greatest franchises in Negro League history. What was Rube Foster doing that was so ahead of his time?
I just think he had a sensational eye for talent. He was a tremendous organizer. He was a brilliant strategist. I oftentimes tell the stories of how he would fine his ball players as much as $5 at the turn of the 1900s if you were tagged out standing up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. You were supposed to slide.
And same thing if they didn't bunt the ball properly.
Absolutely.
Like, he was a perfectionist.
He would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, he would fine them. So he was adamant about the style of play that would become signature in Negro Leagues Baseball. Fast, aggressive, daring. They'd bunt their way on. They'd steal second. They'd steal third. And man, if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And that really was the style of play that drew both black and white fans who were sitting side by side watching what many would say the best baseball being played in this country. Without question, the most entertaining brand of baseball. And that is what Rube Foster brought to the table.
Rube didn't just own the Chicago American Giants, but like you said, he managed them. How common was that in the Negro Leagues for a team to be owned and managed by the same person?
It was fairly common. You know, you had guys like C.I. Taylor that ran the team, owned the team, managed the team. So it was fairly common. Mm-hmm. Rube was brilliant at it, though. And he separated himself from a lot of folks with his acute understanding of this game and how this game should be played. Now, the other Negro League owners, they left the managing to the other guys, but there were a handful of guys who did both. They owned and managed.
Yeah. There had been many other attempts at creating black baseball leagues, but all of them failed in one way or another. Mm-hmm. Why did Rube Foster's league work?
He was brilliant. He was a baseball savant. And he had to be a masterful salesman because he had to convince these other independent black baseball team owners to give up their independency.
And to trust him.
Exactly, in order for black baseball to not only survive, but thrive. Mm-hmm. And of course, he would convince them in a meeting held on February 13, 1920, at the Paseo YMCA, right around the corner from where the museum currently operates. He just was absolutely brilliant. And that's why I say he is the greatest baseball mind this sport has ever seen, even though most people don't know who the heck he is.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we change that. All right, back to the statues. At first base, you have Buck Leonard, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1972. Walter Buck Leonard was one of the best pure hitters to play in the Negro Leagues. He was also a key part of the Homestead Grays dynasty of the 1930s and 40s. He spent his entire 15-year career with the Grays, making his the longest term of service for a player with one team in Negro League history. Everything I've ever read or heard about Buck Leonard says that as great of a hitter as he was an even nicer man.
Yes.
Tell me about Buck Leonard.
Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Arguably the greatest first baseman to ever play this game. If you are a fan of the history of our sport, he was compared to Lou Gehrig, but believed to have even greater defensive abilities than Gehrig. And the old-timers in the Negro League say the greatest fastball hitter this sport has ever seen. They would say that sneaking a fastball past Buck Leonard was like trying to sneak sunrise past the rooster. You couldn't do it. He'd sit dead red and would not miss. What a rarity it was to have a ball player stay with one franchise, as Buck Leonard did. That was virtually unheard of.
Yeah.
Because the guys were oftentimes jumping to a better payday.
Right.
Buck Leonard was a lifetime Homestead Grays man. And I never got to meet him, but from everything that I've ever heard from anybody who knew him, they would never say a disparaging word about Buck Leonard, the man. Yeah. So you're right. As great a ball player as he was, and he is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, he was an even greater human being. That is what, I'm sure he was very proud of, the human qualities that he represented, also with the brilliance in which he played this game.
He played in a league record 11 East-West All-Star games, and beginning in 1942, his Homestead Grays advanced to 4 consecutive Negro World Series, winning in 1943 and 44. In 1952, with the color barrier already broken, Buck was offered a major league contract at the age of 45, but he turned it down. He said, "I knew I was over the hill. I didn't try to fool myself." Leonard wasn't able to get a high school diploma until the age of 52 because his hometown didn't have a high school that allowed education for African Americans. I know that when it came to Shoeless Joe Jackson and many other white ball players, especially in the South in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of them left school early if they even went at all because they needed to make money for their families. And then sometimes they would leave those jobs because they knew that they could make more money playing ball than they had been while they were working. Was that common in the Negro Leagues also for players to not have been fully educated before starting their careers?
Of course, although people are so shocked to learn that nearly 40% of the athletes who played in the Negro Leagues had some level of college education.
Yes.
Less than 5% of those who played in the major leagues at the same time had any college education, for the simple reason then the majors didn't want you to go to college.
Right.
They got you right out of high school, and then you'd work your way to the big leagues. Well, the Negro Leagues didn't have that sophisticated kind of farm system. So what did they do? They trained oftentimes on the campuses of historically black colleges and universities. And then they would play the black college baseball teams and would recruit a great deal of their workforce from those HBCUs, which is why they had a disproportionate number of college-educated athletes, although the prevailing belief was that the athletes in the Negro Leagues weren't smart enough to play in the major leagues. Now,
Right.
I don't know when you had to be a Rhodes Scholar to play baseball, but that was the prevailing belief, when in actuality they had a greater proportion of college-educated athletes in comparison to the major leagues. Jackie Robinson, while he didn't go to an HBCU, went to UCLA.
Right.
So when he walks into that Dodgers clubhouse, he was likely the most intellectual being in that clubhouse. Larry Doby had gone to Long Island College. Monty Irvin went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Buck O'Neill went to Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. Yeah. So they were scholar athletes, but there were others who would go and pursue their baseball careers. Some would quit playing baseball because they could make more money doing some other things because they weren't making a lot of money unless you played year-round.
Right.
Yeah, now those who were superstars, you made more money. And then, of course, you the opportunity to play year-round because you go play winter ball in many of those places. You know, they could go to Cuba, they could go to Mexico or Puerto Rico or Venezuela or the Dominican Republic and actually make more money in those countries than they were making in the Negro Leagues.
And they were treated better, which we'll talk about later. All right, at second base, you have Pop Lloyd, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1977. John Henry Pop Lloyd was discovered on the sandlots of Jacksonville by Rube Foster, Harry Buckner, and Saul White. Lloyd actually played more shortstop than second base and was frequently compared to Honus Wagner.
Wagner said it was a compliment to be compared to Pop Lloyd.
Why was his nickname Just in Time?
Because he could get it there. Because he would toy with the runners. Yeah, he had a cannon over there.
He was like Omar Vizquel in this way.
So he let you get down the line, think you're going to beat it out, and pop. It was right in there. Yeah. And of course, Babe Ruth called him the greatest player that he had ever seen because he could do it all. That's how great he was. And you're right. We have him at second base because of the way we chose the team. We chose the players on the Field of Legends based on when they went in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
So some of the guys are not in that natural position. But if you played in the Negro Leagues, you
everywhere.
likely played multiple positions anyway. So he did play more shortstop than he did second base.
He was part of the 1910 Chicago Leland Giants team who went 123-6. But he played where the money was, whether that was in America or in Cuba. I understand why players were willing to go anywhere and play for whoever was offering them the most money. But my question is, how did those teams get in touch with these guys in the first place? Teams in America, sure, if you're barnstorming or just playing other teams, they're going to notice you and maybe say, hey, you're great, come play with us. But how were teams in Cuba or Mexico hearing about guys like Pop Lloyd? And then how were they reaching out to them to come play for them? How did that work?
Well, Buck O'Neill said when he first went to Cuba, he's in Edward Waters College. And Adolph Luque, Havana, Cuba, saw him playing.
Okay.
And offered him a contract to go down to Havana to play in Cuba. And at that time, I think Buck said they offered him $500 a month to go play. And as Buck would say, that was the end of the education.
Yep.
Yeah, no, he jumped ship. And so you saw quite a bit of that where guys would stay connected with these teams that were part of these other baseball teams in these other countries. And they would go play winter ball there. And quite frankly, the major leaguers were going down to play winter ball too. And these teams in these other countries, they had the pick of the litter of the very best of the best. And And they were bringing more Negro League players down than they were major leaguers.
Yes. Pop Lloyd also played in the first ever game between two black teams at Yankee Stadium. It was July 5th, 1930, when New York's Lincoln Giants played a doubleheader against the Baltimore Black Sox. Lloyd was the first baseman and the manager of the Lincoln Giants, and at age 46 was the team's third best hitter with a .381 average. I feel like this is not a super uncommon story for the truly great Negro League players, though. Some of them played well into their 40s, and maybe they weren't as productive or as feared as they were in their 20s, but they were still absolutely contributing. Why is that such a common story among the greats of the Negro Leagues?
They were baseball lifers. They really were. You know, we talked about Buck Leonard. Buck Leonard hit over 400 when he was 40 years old.
Right.
Yeah, and you're right. He turned down an opportunity to go to the majors because he knew he was too old. Mm-hmm. Pop Lloyd could still play. Buck O'Neil, when he was managing the Monarchs, was player manager. Mm-hmm. And he would still insert himself in critical situations because he looked down the bench and he said, wait a minute, I don't think there's anybody on that bench that can hit better than me. Because they were baseball lifers, I think they did a really good job of keeping themselves in great physical condition so that it allowed them to have those lengthy, meaningful playing careers. So they just weren't there just to be on the team, that they would still contribute at an age that seemingly was beyond measure for still playing the game and playing the game well at that time.
At shortstop, you have Judy Johnson, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1975. William Julius Johnson got the nickname Judy because he resembled a Chicago American Giants player named Judy Gans. Mm-hmm. Johnson was the Negro League's top third baseman in the 1920s and 30s, but his statue is at shortstop here. Because of his slick fielding defensive abilities, he was known as the Black Pie Trainer. He wasn't super fast, but he studied pitchers meticulously and used his knowledge to gain an advantage on the base paths. Former teammate and roommate Ted Page said, Judy Johnson was the smartest third baseman I ever came across. A scientific ball player, he did everything with grace and poise. Tell us a little bit about Judy Johnson.
Yeah, no, and he did. He played more third base than he did shortstop. I think it's the cerebral side that made Judy Johnson so special. He was an absolute student of the game. Great hands, great range, strong arm, quick release. He played the hot corner as well as anybody played the hot corner. And the reason that we have him at shortstop was because we had to make room for Ray Dandridge at third base. But Judy Johnson is also the guy who is credited with having discovered a phenom by the name of Joshua Gibson.
Pretty neat story on this one. I was going to get to it when we talk about Josh, but let's talk about it now.
Now, Josh had already started to earn a reputation as a kind of a sandlot star there in the Pittsburgh area. And in a game where the Homestead Grays catcher got hurt, Judy Johnson went in the stands and pulled a young Josh Gibson out, put him behind the plate. Needless to say, the Homestead Grays catcher that got hurt never got his job back. But, you know, to lose your job to Josh Gibson, that ain't the worst thing that could happen.
Right. Yeah, that's the Wally Pipp story, you know. Connie Mack once told him, if you were a white boy, you could have named your own price, about Judy Johnson. In one of the biggest trades in Negro League history, Josh Gibson and Judy Johnson were traded to the Homestead Grays for $2,500 and two journeyman players, Henry Spearman and Pepper Bassett, on March 20th, 1937. Did trades happen often between Negro League teams?
Not as regular as you saw in today's game, but that did happen. Buck O'Neil essentially got traded to the Kansas City Monarchs from the Memphis Red Sox. Trade was set up, and the great Andy Cooper would bring Buck over. Cooper was managing the Monarchs. So you saw these trades occur. That's a big deal, what you're talking about, as it related to Judy and Josh. That's a game-changing kind of deal. Now, Pepper Bassett was a good ball player, but, man, you got two Hall of Famers in Judy Johnson and Josh Gibson. So whoever orchestrated that trade...
he knew what he was doing. Well, one of them knew what he was doing.
Exactly.
Judy Johnson retired 9 years before the integration of the major leagues, but in 1954, he became the first African-American to coach in Major League Baseball. He scouted and coached for the Philadelphia Athletics and the Philadelphia Phillies. All right, and then you also brought up just a second ago that at third base, the statue down on the Field of Legends is Ray Dandridge, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1987. He grew up idolizing Judy Johnson, and some say he eventually became a better ball player than Johnson. Dandridge was a contact hitter who could hit to all fields and a fancy fielder at third base who could also play shortstop, second base, and the outfield. He signed his first professional contract at the age of 19 with the Detroit Stars in 1933, then moved on to the Newark Eagles the following year where he'd play off and on for the next decade. He was part of the $1 million infield of the 1937 Newark Eagles, along with Willie Wells at short, Dick Say at second, and Mule Suttles at first. Tell me about Ray Dandridge.
From Richmond, Virginia, I oftentimes say when I'm giving tours of the museum, the greatest third baseman to have never played in the major leagues was Ray Dandridge.
Yeah.
Ray Dandridge made it up to the old Minneapolis Millers, which were the New York Giants AAA team.
Yeah.
Ray Dandridge was named MVP of the Millers when he was almost 38 years old.
Mm-hmm.
There was no room in the major leagues for a 38-year-old anything, no less a 38-year-old black third baseman. So he never got the opportunity to fulfill that dream of playing in the major leagues. He's with the Millers at the same time that a young phenom by the name of Willie Mays was there. When the Giants came to go get Mays from the Millers, fans were disappointed because Willie was only hitting something ridiculous like 473.
Right.
But they were basically begging him not to take Ray Dandridge.
Mm-hmm.
The fans in Minneapolis absolutely loved Ray Dandridge. And Ray Dandridge had big, wide bow legs. And his teammates used to tease him that his legs were so bow that you could drive a train between his legs, but a baseball would never get between them because he could flat out pick it. And not only was he legendary in the Negro Leagues, he was also legendary in places like Mexico and other places in Spanish-speaking countries. Ray Dandridge was an incredible ball player.
Yeah, he also played for the New York Cubans and spent off seasons playing and managing in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. He also played a year in Venezuela and was one of the first to head to the Mexican League, where he spent most of the 1940s. But that meant that he was a victim of Commissioner Happy Chandler's 5-year ban for players who played in that league. So even after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, Ray was technically ineligible to play in the newly integrated major leagues. We may see that as a punishment, and it potentially cost him some fame and fortune, but the Reverend Bill Greason once said, "Playing in the Negro Leagues was a struggle, but at the end of the day, you struggled together. If you made it to the majors, you struggled alone." How did players in the Negro Leagues view the historically white major leagues when it came to that?
Well, I think up until Jackie breaks the color barrier, it was still considered a pipe dream. Even though there had been inklings of integration. You hear stories of how Clark Griffith had tinkered with the notion of integrating the Washington Senators even before Branch Rickey made the move to go get Jackie. Because he was watching Buck Leonard and Josh Gibson do things in his ballpark that mere mortals had not done.
Right.
But he was also watching this huge black fan base fill up his ballpark. And I think when it finally came to whether or not he would risk being ostracized by his peers, or should he just keep generating this revenue because the Homestead Grays were outdrawing the Washington Senators in his ballpark. He's getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concession.
On days when the ballpark otherwise would have not been used.
Yeah. And so he didn't have to work that hard for that money. And so I think he just ultimately decided that it was a safer proposition to keep the money than try to buck the system and fight the other owners to try and bring integration into the fold, particularly at a time when perhaps the timing was not quite right as it was for Rickey, because we'd now come out of World War II when Rickey makes the decision to go try and bring Jackie into Major League Baseball. Yeah, no, I think that played a role. So I don't think they really started to think about the major leagues until Jackie breaks the color barrier. And now it becomes real.
Former player Lenny Pearson recalled that as a manager, Ray Dandridge, quote, wanted perfection, complete perfection. That's the way he played baseball. So just another interesting tidbit about Ray. In left field, you've got Cool Papa Bell, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1974. James Thomas Cool Papa Bell started with the St. Louis Stars as a pitcher, but he hurt his arm, so they moved him to the outfield. Where did he get his nickname?
Cool Papa. First and foremost, it's the greatest nickname in baseball history, bar none.
Bar none.
Because if I tell people James Thomas Bell, people are like, who?
Right.
But you tell them Cool Papa, and most folks' eyes perk up. He falls into that category of one of the most legendary stars this game has ever seen because of the blazing speed.
Yes.
He earned his nickname Cool Papa because he did come to the St. Louis Stars as a pitcher. And in a bases-loaded clutch situation, he's facing the great Oscar Charleston, and young Cool Papa Bell gets him out. And someone on the Stars bench said, that's one Cool Papa, and the name stuck. And it became legendary, and it matched his persona because Cool was cool. As Buck O'Neill would describe him as a snazzy dresser. Yeah, no, Cool was cool. Had no vices, but on the base paths, he was legendary. As I tell people, the speed seems mythical in nature,
Yes.
but it was very real. And he may have been the greatest base runner this sport has ever seen. We talk about the speed, but Buck O'Neil would talk about his uncanny base running ability, that he had the ability to cut the bag on the inside, where most guys had to make that big round turn at first. Cool was cutting it on the inside, and he was so adept that he could hit the inside corner with his lead left foot. And sometimes the umpire would think that he had missed the bag because they weren't accustomed to seeing guys hit the bag in that way. And Buck would say that he was so low to the ground that he could smack the bag with his hand and not fall over. You know, sometimes the good Lord gives some of us something that he just doesn't give the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And he gave Cool Papa not only the great wheels, but also the tremendous control of his body lean. He switch hit it, but he hit primarily left-handed. And so he's coming out the box running. And so you hear these stories, they were routine stories of how he turned singles into doubles, doubles into triples, triples into inside the park home runs. And so maybe it was a twist of fate that he hurt his arm, mm-hmm. and they moved him to the outfield where he could practically run down everything. So he didn't have a great throwing arm because it had hurt his arm, mm-hmm. but he played very shallow, and you couldn't bloop it in front of him.
Right.
And you had to hit it on a rope to get it over his head, and he had a very quick release. Mm-hmm. And so it made him a tremendous defensive outfielder, even without the cannon outfield arm like you see from a lot of guys who played. Yeah, but Cool could do everything that you could do on the baseball diamond, and he did it with style and a little flair. Absolutely.
Yeah, they call him the fastest man to ever play baseball. He was once time circling the bases in 12 seconds flat. And for context, the fastest time recorded around the bases in white Major League Baseball is 13.3 seconds, which was set by Ever Swanson in 1932, according to the physics of baseball. In the modern StatCast era, Byron Buxton holds the record for the fastest home-to-home run, clocking in at 13.85 seconds in 2017. So Cool Papa Bell did it in 12 flat.
Yeah.
Let's get this out of the way because I know everyone wants to hear it. Tell me the story about Cool Papa Bell's bet with Satchel Paige in the hotel.
Well, Cool and Satchel were teammates on some great, great ball clubs. And when they traveled, they were oftentimes roommates. So on this particular instance, old Cool gets to the hotel room before Satchel. And he walks in the room, he flips on the light switch. There's a delay before the light comes on. He flipped the light switch off. There's a delay before the light goes out. And old Cool Papa says, uh-huh. When Satchel gets to the room, Cool is waiting on him. Satchel gets in bed. Cool hops up. He says, Roomie, I'm so fast, I can flip this light switch off, run over, hop in bed, cover up before the room goes dark. And Satchel's like, Cool, you fast, but you ain't that fast. Cool Papa Bell bet his meal money. And Satchel took the bait. And in one of the greatest sports pranks of all time, because that light had a shortage in it, Cool was able to flip that light switch off, run over, hop in bed, cover up before the room went completely dark. Satchel was so outdone that he just always told folks that Cool was essentially faster than a light switch.
Unbelievable. One of my favorite stories of all time. He wasn't just fast, though. He was smart. He watched the pitcher's feet and was more careful with pitchers who had a good move. If he took a big lead, it usually meant he wasn't stealing, but if he took a small lead, there was a good chance he was going. He once stole 175 bases in a single season. Granted, they played 185 to 190 games, but still. He once said, I remember one time I got 5 hits and stole 5 bases, but none of it was written down because they forgot to bring the scorebook to the game that day. So as impressive as his statistics seem, who knows what they may have truly been.
Yeah.
And that's one of the difficult things for the average fan to be able to wrap their head around. White baseball teams have had their statistics tracked and documented and printed in newspapers dating back to the 1850s. So it's hard for some people to understand why black ball players and why black teams don't have that same infallible record keeping. Why is it that we don't have those records to look back on for the Negro Leagues and for other black baseball games from throughout history?
Well, more times than not, those records were kept, but they were lost to time. And so now you're relying solely on box scores, and that was very much a rarity in mainstream papers. So if it's not for the black press, we would know very little about the history of the Negro Leagues and any of these statistics. I have to give a lot of credit to those Negro League historians and researchers who have done yeoman's duty to try and unearth as much of this data as they possibly could. to create quantitative information, which allowed us last May 29th to move these statistics of the Negro Leagues into the record books of Major League Baseball. I won't say that it was like finding a needle in a haystack, but it damn near was.
Right.
And so much of this information had seemingly been lost to time. And they went back and unearthed as much of this as they could. I will still think that this will be an ongoing effort. I think you're still going to discover things that maybe that was missed.
Absolutely.
Even as they were going through this process. But that is what really made bringing the data from the information, stats of the Negro Leagues forward until what we saw here last year. And that was a 3.5-year effort by what I call a dream team of Negro League historians and researchers who pulled this information together.
Yeah. Cool Papa Bell was a great bunter himself, but he also scored from first base on another player's bunt 2 times in his career.
Yes.
On another occasion, he went from first to third so fast that the other team protested the game since they figured he had to have been cheating. At the time, Jesse Owens was known as the fastest man in the world. He would race against horses, but he refused to race against Cool Papa Bell. But also after his career, he discovered Ernie Banks while he was scout for the Kansas City Monarchs. When Lou Brock broke the record for most stolen bases in a single season, why was Cool Papa Bell there?
Because Cool had mentored Lou. So when Lou comes over to the Cardinals from the Chicago Cubs, and let us not forget that it was the great Buck O'Neil who signed Lou Brock to the Cubs. And it was Buck O'Neil who was the last guy to sign off on what became one of the worst trades in baseball history when the Cubs traded Lou to St. Louis for a pitcher named Ernie Broglio. Unfortunately, Mr. Broglio was damaged goods. And I think that fueled that rivalry between the Cubs and the Cardinals because the Cardinals kind of duped him. They sent him damaged goods, and Lou Brock, the minute he left Chicago and landed in St. Louis, he took off. And Lou would say that one of the first people that reached out to him when he came to St. Louis was the legendary Cool Papa Bell. Now, he said, I knew who Cool Papa Bell was, but I didn't think Cool Papa Bell knew who I was.
Interesting.
And he said he wanted to meet with me. And Lou would go on to say that Cool Papa started telling him things about base stealing and base running that he said he never heard before. He would say, Cool Papa, I never saw this in the book. And he said, Cool would say, because Lou, it ain't in the book. And so when Lou sets the single season base stealing record, Cool is there for the ceremony. As they're going through the formal ceremony, Cool has the bag in his hand. And they finally get over to Cool and they give him the microphone. And Cool says, Lou, we gonna give you this base. Because if we don't give it to you, you gonna steal it anyway. And so there was a wonderful relationship that was established between Lou and the legendary Cool Papa Bell, who lived and died in St. Louis. I tell people they got a street named for him there in St. Louis. I believe it's in North St. Louis. And the speed limit is probably 25, 30 miles an hour. They should have named a section of the freeway for Cool Papa Bell. That's too slow.
I love it. In center field, you have Oscar Charleston,
Yes.
who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1976. A powerful hitter who could hit to all fields and bunt, Charleston was extremely fast on the base paths and in center field. He played a very shallow center, almost behind second base. His great speed and instincts helped him outrun many batted balls, and he had a powerful arm. Coupled with his great natural ability was an aggressive demeanor and will to win. Buck O'Neil said that Willie Mays was the greatest major league player he ever saw, but Oscar Charleston was the greatest baseball player he ever saw. Tell me a little bit about Oscar Charleston.
He had great reverence for the great Oscar Charleston, the Hoosier Comet, as he was called. To me, Oscar Charleston was one of the first 2 superstars of Rube Foster's newly formed Negro National League in 1920. Now, the league was filled with stars, but Charleston and Bullet Rogan were superstars.
Yeah.
Charleston played center field. Big barrel-chested guy, great speed. Well, the consummate 5-tool player. Hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. There was nothing that Charlie could not do. If you are a fan of the history of our game, he was compared to have the defensive prowess of Tris Speaker, the tenacity of Ty Cobb. Charlie would fight you. Now, he usually wouldn't start the fight, but he would end the fight. He once snatched the hood off of a Ku Klux Klansman and lived to tell about it. and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. In 1921, as a member then of the St. Louis Giants, he had one of the greatest single seasons not in black baseball history, but in baseball history, when he led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. He was Willie Mays before we ever knew who Willie Mays was. And I remember the first time Mr. Mays comes to visit the museum and Buck is there, and Mr. Mays gets in through the turnstiles. He looks out onto the field, and as any center fielder would do, he wanted to know,
who's in my spot?
Who's that in center field? Yeah. And Buck looked at him and said, Willie, that was you before there ever was a you. And Buck said he never saw a center fielder who could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. You talked about it, uncanny instinct. So he played a very shallow center field. So you really couldn't bloop it in front of him. And unless you hit it on a rope, you couldn't get it over his head. I always share with my visitors when Mays makes the great catch in the World Series there in the Polo Ground. And honestly, the throw was better than the catch. But because he ran a country mile and made that great over-the-shoulder basket catch, that's what everybody remembers. It's called the catch.
Right.
All the old-timers in the Negro League say, had that been Oscar Charleston, he'd have been waiting for that ball to come down.
For years, we've known that the top 3 batting averages in Major League history are Ty Cobb at number 1 with a 366 average, Rogers Hornsby number 2 with a 358 average, and Shoeless Joe Jackson 3rd with a career average of 356. But when the Negro League statistics were incorporated into the white Major League record books, Josh Gibson overtook first place, which dropped Ty Cobb to second, and Oscar Charleston slid into third place all-time with a 363 career average, 5 points higher than Hornsby. He had a great season in 1925 when he hit .427 for the Harrisburg Giants to go along with 20 home runs and 97 RBI. He won batting titles in the Eastern Colored League in 1924 and 25, but his 1931 season with the Homestead Grays was pretty good too. He batted .346 with 58 doubles, 26 triples, and 19 home runs that year. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum owns Oscar Charleston's personal scrapbook. What is represented more than any other time in his career in that scrapbook?
Most of that scrapbook focuses on his time in Cuba.
Yeah.
Where he was a folk hero in Cuba. And you'll see these cartoons, and they'll depict Oscar Charleston with the big bat.
Yeah, I love those.
The big giant bat. And he was legendary in Cuba, played on some great teams there. He was probably a bigger star, bigger, well-known star there than he ever was here in the U.S.
Yeah, very interesting. In right field, you have Leon Day, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1995. A quiet, soft-spoken, and modest right-hander, Leon Day could play any position on the field besides catcher. His statue's in the outfield here at the museum, but he was a great, great pitcher with a deceptive fastball and a sharp curve. He faced off against Satchel Paige 4 times in his career. How did those games go?
Leon Day got the best.
Pretty wild, isn't it?
Yeah, no, Leon Day, the great Monty Irvin would say, if you saw Bob Gibson pitch, but you didn't see Leon Day, then you saw Leon Day. He said Bob Gibson had nothing on Leon Day. Competitor, tough, fearless. Leon Day, as you mentioned, played every position except for catcher. Buck O'Neil believed that Leon Day was a better center fielder than he was pitcher.
Wow.
And is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a pitcher. We've been enamored, and rightfully so, with this phenom by the name of Shohei Ohtani. His success has given me an opportunity to talk about the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues, and Leon Day was one of those great two-way stars. He was from Alexandria, Virginia, but lived and died in Baltimore, Maryland. Leon Day, and I thought about this here recently after the untimely passing of our friend Dave Parker, a month shy of his induction into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. May his soul rest in peace. And I thought about Leon Day when Dave passed away because Leon Day was the last Negro Leaguer to still be alive to learn that he was going into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He was in a Baltimore hospital when he got the news, and sadly, 6 days later, he passed away.
Right.
But at least he knew he was going into the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Tell me about the 1942 East-West All-Star Game.
Well, you know, number one, the East-West All-Star Game That was the creme de la creme, the best of the best. And in many ways, it was bigger than the Negro League World Series. And Leon Day was dominant in that 42 All-Star game. 42 was a good year.
Yeah.
42, the Monarchs would win the World Series. And the Homestead Grays brought Leon Day as a ringer to face off against the Monarchs, and he shut them out.
Right.
But they threw that game out because he wasn't part of the roster. The Monarchs protested. And, of course, he was dominant in that 42 East-West All-Star game.
He also played in the 1946 Negro League World Series as well. Leon Day was on the short list with Josh Gibson and Willie Wells of players that the Pittsburgh Pirates were considering signing to break the color barrier before the Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson. Why didn't that end up happening?
They got scared.
Yeah.
They knew, like most knew.
Pittsburgh had two great Negro League teams.
If they'd have been bold enough with the talent that was there in Pittsburgh between the Crawfords and the Homestead Grays,
they would have won every World Series for a decade.
It would have shifted the pendulum. We wouldn't have talked about the Yankees. We'd been talking about the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Yeah.
In the same vein in which we now talk about those great Yankee teams of yesteryear. But I don't think guys were quite ready to try and buck the system. And again, unfortunately, the timing just wasn't right. But man, I mean, how much great talent was right there in the Pirates' backyard if they'd have been bold enough to attempt to make that happen.
Yeah. You've got the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays right there. Leon Day's baseball career was interrupted by World War II, and he was one of the soldiers who stormed the beaches at Normandy. Why would black ball players, or black people in general, want to fight for a country that wasn't fighting for them?
I asked Buck O'Neill that same question, and he looked at me, and he was very succinct, but he was also very poignant, because we were American. What greater way to prove how American you are than service to your country? But you're right. They were fighting for a country that wasn't fighting for them. I've only seen Buck somewhat sullen because he was the most upbeat, positive individual that I've ever met. You know, the glass was always half full. It was never partly cloudy. It was partly sunny. That was Buck's disposition. But when he talked about his wartime, he would become a little sullen because the POWs were treated better than they were. The POWs were sitting in the front of the bus. They were relegated to the back of the bus, having fought for this country. Yeah, but they wanted to prove that they were American, and I do think there's no greater way than service to your country.
Leon Day's first game back from the military was May 5th, 1946, when he was the starting pitcher for the Newark Eagles. It was opening day of the 1946 season, and the Eagles were facing the Philadelphia Stars. In his first game since 1943, Leon threw a no-hitter. Now, for years, we've been told that Bob Feller's no-hitter against the White Sox on April 16, 1940 at Comiskey Park is the only opening day no-hitter in Major League history. But since Major League Baseball now recognizes 7 Negro Leagues as major leagues for the period between 1920 and 1948, including the Negro National League, that means that Leon Day's opening day no-hitter should also be recognized. The first Negro National League game was played May 2nd, 1920 between the Chicago American Giants and the Indianapolis ABCs, who won the game 4-2. The ABCs were managed by C.I. Taylor, and Chicago was managed by Rube Foster. Both of them were black, and since Major League Baseball now recognizes 7 Negro Leagues as major leagues for the period between 1920 and 1948, including the Negro National League, that means that Frank Robinson did not become the first black manager in Major League history when he was at the helm for the Cleveland Indians on April 8, 1975. C.I. Taylor and Rube Foster had done it, unknowingly, 55 years earlier. I haven't heard anyone bring this up before, and Cleveland celebrated the 50th anniversary of Robinson's achievement earlier this year, while still calling him the first black manager in Major League history. Is there maybe something we can do to have Rube Foster and C.I. Taylor recognized and honored? Because they were the first black managers now.
Well, and you know, when we look at semantics of what now represents Major League Baseball, we just opened up a new exhibit, Leaders and Innovators, because we wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Robinson becoming the first full-time manager in what was considered white major leagues at that time. I don't know if we'll ever get that kind of reflected, or it certainly might become an asterisk in the pages of American history books at some point in time. And so for me, I look at it from the standpoint of sharing this history with folks, that people know that May 2nd, 1920, the first Negro Leagues game was officially held. You know, for me, that's good enough. We focused on the fact that it took 28 years after Jackie breaks the color barrier that you get, quote unquote, your first full-time manager in Frank Robinson. and that it was 29 years after Jackie breaks the color barrier that you get your first African-American GM in Bill Lucas. Now, of course, if you go back and you set that stage, as you just mentioned, then you had all these other guys who were executives running these teams that would be mentioned in that discussion when we talk about the hierarchy of integration in our game.
Another thing to consider, though, is that Negro League teams winning the Negro League World Series, those count as official World Series wins now. So when people in Cleveland say that the city has only seen 2 World Series winners, 1920 and 1948, that's no longer technically true. No. The Cleveland Buckeyes won the Negro League World Series in 1945. What can current Major League teams do to better honor and remember the Negro League teams from their city's past, whether they were champions or not?
Well, I think just the in-stadium celebrations are things that continue to help keep the Negro Leagues in the forefront. We just had our salute to the Negro Leagues with the Kansas City Royals, and the pageantry of those days are always amazing, and the fans really enjoy it. Because, again, no sport holds to its history the way baseball does. And I think if you're a baseball fan, you should want to know about the history of the Negro Leagues. If you're a fan of American history, you should want to know about the Negro Leagues. But if you're particularly a baseball fan, you should want to know about the history of the Negro Leagues. And I think these in-stadium celebrations, the partnerships that we're able to continue to forge with major league teams, the exhibitions that we continue to build and take them around the country. Our Barrier Breaker exhibit just left San Diego, where it had a tremendous run in partnership with the Padres. So these are ways in which we are kind of elevating Negro Leagues history in our quest to continue to give it a mainstream voice. The work that we've done in the video game, MLB The Show, has introduced the Negro Leagues to millions of young people and young adults who I'm not sure would have thought about the Negro Leagues had we not put them in that video game. And it's been one of the biggest endeavors that this museum has ever embarked on, and it is paying off tremendous dividends because I am seeing scores upon scores upon scores of young people, young adults, who are walking through this museum because they saw the museum in the video game, and they all want to meet the guy that's telling stories in the video game, me.
That's pretty cool. Very cool.
Yeah, no, it has made me a household name in the gaming community. And honestly, I saw myself doing a lot of things I never dreamt that I would be in a video game.
All right, back to the statues. On the mound, you've got Satchel Paige, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1971. I'm definitely not saying that the only reason we know about most Negro League players today is because of a white man, especially since it was because of white men who caused the Negro Leagues to exist in the first place. But tell me about the importance of the speech that Ted Williams gave in Cooperstown, New York on July 25th, 1966, during his own Hall of Fame induction ceremony.
It was prolific.
This is the nature of man and the name of the game, and I've always been a very lucky guy to have worn a baseball uniform, to have struck out or to hit a tape measure home run. And I hope that someday the names of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson in some way can be added as a symbol of the great Negro players that are not here only because they were not given a chance.
I don't think that you would have seen the inclusion of Negro League players in the Hall of Fame if Ted doesn't make that speech. You certainly would not have seen it as soon as we saw it.
Right.
And it took a superstar to advocate. And Ted Williams, of course, used his own induction speech there in 1966 to boldly advocate for the inclusion of Negro League players in the Hall of Fame, as he would go on to say, as symbols of those great black stars who were not there because they'd never been given an opportunity. In this case, he mentioned directly the names of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson as those symbols.
And who were the first 2 players to be inducted then?
Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. Satchel would go into the Hall of Fame in 1971, 5 years after Ted Williams' remarkable speech.
And Josh Gibson the year after that.
Gibson the year after. And a lot of people thought that that was out of the ordinary for Ted, because I think they saw Ted as being selfish. You know, in their eyes, Ted liked Ted. And I think Ted did like Ted. You know, even amongst his own peers on the team, they would sometimes get upset because he had great eyes. And he might take that pitch that was on the outside where he could have hit it and driven in a run. But, you know, Ted had an innate understanding and appreciation for what these players had accomplished. He had played with and against them. And a lot of people did not realize that Ted was Mexican-American.
Right.
His mother was Mexican.
Yeah.
And so he had, I think, a deeper understanding and appreciation, and he used his own induction. He wasn't coerced into this. This was something that he wanted to do because he felt it was the right place, the right time to make that avocation on behalf of these great stars that he knew could play. And like I said, you needed a superstar. This couldn't be just the average Joe.
Right.
Nobody would have paid it any attention. But when Ted Williams says it, you've got to take it into consideration because of who he was and how great a ball player he was.
And like you said, Ted didn't get along with too many people. So if he's saying these are guys who I respect, they must have been great.
You got to believe they were great.
There are a million amazing Satchel Paige stories. What is your favorite?
Yeah, there's so many. And I fortunately got to tell some of those stories in the video game. And one of my favorites is one that I heard Buck O'Neil say on many occasions. They're playing in the Denver Post tournament. And so Satchel has his Satchel Paige All-Stars, and they're playing an all-white semi-pro team from the Coors Brewing Company. And so Buck is playing first for Satchel and his All-Stars. And Buck says the first kid from the Coors team steps into the batter's box. He digs in. Satchel throws him a fastball. Kid swung as hard as he could. He topped it, and he dribbles it down the third base line, and he beats it out, gets an infield hit. Well, Buck says about that time, one of the kids from the Coors team steps out on top of the dugout steps, and he yells out, "Let's beat him. He ain't nothing but an overrated darky." Well, now, if you knew Satchel was likely more offended by being called overrated than he was by being called a darky. But anyway, Satchel looks over at first base, and of course his nickname famously for Buck O'Neil was Nancy, which is a whole nother story, folks. We ain't got time to tell you that story. But anyway, he looks over at first base. He says, "Nancy, did you hear that?" Buck said, "Yes, Satchel, I heard him." He said, "Nancy, bring him in." And so Buck is at first base. He motions for the outfield to take a couple of steps in. Satchel looks at first base. He said, "Nancy, bring them all the way in." Honest to God's truth. There were 7 guys kneeling around the mound. Satchel Paige and the catcher. And Satchel strikes out the side on 9 straight pitches. He looks into the Coors dugout and says, "Overrated darky, hey." And of course, Buck said by now the kid who had said this was embarrassed. He was crying, and all the guys came out to apologize to Satchel and his teammates. But Buck O'Neil swore to the day he died, if he had one game to win and any choice of any pitcher from any era, it would be the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige. He said you might beat him when he was out there messing around, but when he was locked and loaded, forget about it.
In the late 1930s, Paige developed arm problems for the first time. Kansas City Monarchs owner J.L. Wilkinson signed Paige to his B team, giving Paige time to heal. Within a year, Paige's shoulder had recovered and his fastball returned. As he aged, the control he once used to dazzle fans now became his primary weapon as a pitcher. What would his catcher put on home plate while Satchel was warming up to help him with his control?
Stick of foil chewing gum wrapper.
Unbelievable.
And it is the honest God's truth. The catcher would sit that foil chewing gum wrapper on top of home plate. And wherever the catcher moved the chewing gum wrapper, Satchel was right over the top of that chewing gum wrapper. And as Satchel would say, he'd work both corners of that chewing gum wrapper. His control was impeccable. He came up, as most youngsters do, just threw hard. Mm-hmm. And then he learned how to pitch. And his control is what set him apart from everybody else. Now, in his prime, they clocked his fastball at 105.
I've heard this story.
And as I tell people, what really made him so special, and we know as baseball fans, 105 is pretty doggone special.
It's pretty special.
But what really made Satchel so special was 105 with the pinpoint control.
Right.
And as Buck would say, while people talked about how dominant his fastball was, his changeup was his out pitch, because he threw that changeup with the exact same arm motion as his fastball. And if you can get it up there at 105, you got to sit on 105. And he dropped that changeup on you, you had no chance. Yeah, no chance. He said he could look at a hitter's knees and knew where he could get him out. Now, he was incredible. There won't ever be another Satchel Paige.
Satchel played on an integrated team in Bismarck, North Dakota in 1935, marking the first time since the 1800s that black players and white players would be teammates on a semi-professional team. How do you think things might have been different if Satchel had been the one to break the color barrier instead of Jackie Robinson?
Buck O'Neil believed that Satchel would not have faced the same level of racism and hatred and vitriol that welcomed Jackie, because Satchel was a known commodity. Mm-hmm. White fans knew who Satchel Paige was. Hell, he had pitched in damn near every city in this country.
Right.
Small towns would all shut down to watch the old man do his thing. And Buck always believed that Satchel would not have gotten the same level of hatred, but no one looked seriously at Satchel being the first, even though he was still the biggest star in the Negro Leagues, because no one knew how old he was.
Right.
And he was likely too charismatic for a lot of those major league owners, so they could just dismiss Satchel and say, well, he's too old. He's too old. And I think in the minds of many, there was too great a risk that a pitcher might fail. And as we know, the first guy can't fail. Right. If the first guy fails, there is no second guy.
Right.
And so they just kind of dismissed Satchel. It took Bill Veeck to go bring Satchel, because now the other owners can kind of dismiss that too, because they just say, oh, that's Veeck being Veeck.
Right. They still thought it was a sideshow.
Exactly.
And then he went 6-1 and led them to the World Series.
Exactly.
People realized maybe he was onto something.
Exactly.
Satchel Paige went on a barnstorming tour with Dizzy Dean, and then a separate barnstorming tour with Bob Feller where they were traveling by plane. Why did he love barnstorming so much, and possibly even more than he loved playing Negro Leagues or Major League Baseball games?
He was free.
Yeah.
He could be himself. He could be his natural showman self. He had to temper himself when he gets to the major leagues. You couldn't do those same kinds of antics that fans enjoyed. You can't go walk the bases loaded to face Josh Gibson. You can't bring the outfield in and sit the infield down. That would have been so frowned at. And so he had to kind of temper himself when he got to the major leagues. But in barnstorming, he could be himself. And he was such a savvy businessman that he was negotiating a percentage of the gate when he traveled around this country playing. But that is why so many people knew who Satchel Paige was, because, again, as I mentioned, he pitched in every corner of this country. Mm-hmm. And so everybody knew Satchel Paige.
Behind the plate, you have Josh Gibson, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1972. The 6'1", 220-pound Gibson was nearly indestructible behind the plate. He occasionally played left field or third base, but never for more than a game or two. Gibson's natural skills were immense. His powerful arm, quick release, and agility made base runners wary of trying to steal on him, even while he was still in his crouch. You've been saying for years that you think Josh Gibson is the greatest ball player of all time. Make the case for me.
If there's any such thing as a 5-tool catcher, Josh was it.
Yeah.
Because he hit for power. He hit for average. He could field. He could run. He was a good running catcher. He might steal you 20, 25 bases to go with that big bat of his. And as I tell my guests, when I say big bat, I mean big bat, 40 ounce, 41 inches. And he was dominating the game at the catcher's position, the most physically demanding position in our sport, because he wasn't a good catcher. As you kind of referenced, he was a great catcher. We purposefully put him in a defensive posture here at the museum because we wanted people to understand how great a catcher he was. Buck O'Neil would say he had complete control of his pitching staff, so he called a great game, and he was a physical specimen. I tell people, if you remember the great Bo Jackson, think Bo Jackson as a catcher, right, and you've got Josh Gibson from a physical standpoint. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was tremendous. Big, powerful hands, big, powerful forearms,
yes,
big, powerful thighs, and great eyes. Buck O'Neil would describe Josh in this fashion, that he had the eyes of Ted Williams and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. So he wasn't just a great power hitter. Josh Gibson was a great hitter with power. And as we discussed earlier, now that the stats of the Negro Leagues are officially entered into the record books of Major League Baseball, he's your all-time career batting leader, 372. Single season batting record in 1943 of 466. Right. I'm going to go out on a limb, folks, and say that ain't going to be broken. Yeah, no, so he was tremendous. I think the greatest combination of power and average this game has ever seen was Josh Gibson, and he was doing it as a catcher. Catchers don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
He once hit a fair ball clean out of Yankee Stadium during a game, something no one else ever did. Not Mickey Mantle, not Babe Ruth, only Josh Gibson. Did Josh Gibson ever break his bats?
As Gibson would tell a young kid from the Monarchs who walked by the Homestead Grays bench, picked up an old broken bat, and he said, "Josh, this must be your bat." And Gibson was sitting on the bench like most graders hit, always got that bat in his hand, and he turned him and showed him the faded out sweet spot of the bat. He said, "Son, I don't break bats. I wear them out."
For most batters, scoring position is when a runner is on second base or third base. What was scoring position during a Josh Gibson at bat?
The minute he stepped in the batter's box, he's in scoring position.
There was a movement in 2020 to have Josh Gibson's name replace Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis' name on the MVP trophy. What would a gesture like that mean, and where do things stand with that? Has there been any progress?
I haven't heard about progress of that effort. I think it would be more than fitting to see Gibson's name be on the MVP, because I just think Josh was that great of a ball player. And he represents everything that was great about the Negro Leagues. Gibson was a great family man. Gibson was one of the greatest baseball players this sport has ever seen. And again, in my opinion, I think you can make the argument that he might have been the greatest baseball player this sport has ever seen. So it would be fitting if his name was there on that MVP trophy.
When we talk about the greatest teams in baseball history, people say the 1927 Yankees, the 1902 Pittsburgh Pirates, the 1907 Chicago Cubs, or the 1929 Philadelphia Athletics. But there have been some unbelievably dominant Negro League teams who are on par with those great white Major League teams, who the average fan has usually never heard of. The 1925 Kansas City Monarchs, the 1931 Homestead Grays, the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords, and the 1942 Kansas City Monarchs. Mm-hmm. 3 of those 4 teams have something in common. Their catcher was Josh Gibson.
And it's not a coincidence that they were great teams.
Tell me a little bit about the 1931 Homestead Grays in particular. They went 143-29 with 2 ties during the regular season, according to Phil Dixon's research. What made that team so great other than Josh Gibson behind the plate?
I think they had 5 or 6 Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
And Gibson was a young phenom on that team at that time. That team was dynamite. And in that debate on greatest teams of all time, and of course in the Negro Leagues, most people can say 31 Homestead Grays, 35 Crawfords. I would give the edge to the 31 Homestead Grays, because while the Crawfords had 5 Hall of Famers, Satchel didn't stay with them the entire season in 35. So that 31 Homestead Grays were stocked with superior talent. And the secondary group of that 31 Grays teams were also great, because there's several guys on that team that you could still make a case that are Hall of Fame worthy. Yeah, that was a tremendous team.
And they had 4 20-game winners on their pitching staff. I mean, that team was unbelievable. Okay, back to the statues, because there are a few we haven't gotten to yet. We talked about all the players in the field, but you can't have a baseball game without a batter at the plate. So for your hitter, you have Martin Dihigo, who was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the class of 1977. He was the best pitcher, he was the best base runner, he could play any position in the infield, and he had the best arm from the outfield. Some say his arm was better than Roberto Clemente's. But you've got his statue as the batter, not on the field playing defense. Why did you guys elect to do that?
Because we wanted to kind of introduce Martin for his all-around baseball prowess. As Monty Irvin would describe him, he would call him a beautiful ball player. He's almost picturesque, 6'3", 6'4". You just touted some of the great features he brought to the table as a player, almost statuesque. He's in 5 different countries, baseball halls of fame.
Just an insane statistic.
Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown, played all 9 positions and played all 9 of them well. His nickname, El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. And what is even more amazing is very few folks have ever heard of the name Martin Dihigo. How could we not know? But as I remind folks, that's the plight of the Negro Leagues.
Right.
And as my late mother would say, you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. He was a legend as a pitcher. He was a legend at the plate. They called him the Babe Ruth of Cuba, and he was the idol of players like Minnie Minoso, who grew up in Cuba. Minoso described him as very elegant. Minoso was able to live out his dream of coming to America and playing in the major leagues, but Dihigo never got that chance. But one year in the Mexican League, he won the pitching title, going 19-2 with a .90 ERA. In that same season, he hit .387 and won the batting title.
Which makes no sense.
He once hit a 2-run home run off Satchel Paige, and everyone in the stadium thought, oh wow, Satchel Paige is hittable. but only if it was Martin Diego at the plate. September 5th, 1938, Page and Diego were both on the mound with the Mexican League pennant on the line. The game went into the 9th inning, tied at 1. How did that game end?
Martin beat him. Walk-off home run to win it.
All right, so we've got a team on the field. We've got someone at the plate ready to hit, but you can't have a game without an umpire. For your umpire, you've got Bob Motley, who was the last surviving Negro League umpire, passing away in September of 2017. Motley worked as an umpire in the Negro Leagues from 1947 to 1958, but he also umpired in the Pacific Coast League, becoming the PCL's second black umpire following Emmett Ashford. There must have been hundreds of black umpires who called Negro League games and black baseball games over the years. What made Bob Motley stand out so much that not only do we know his name in the first place, but we still remember him today?
Well, he brought a flair to the game. And the umpires of the Negro Leagues brought a little panache to the game.
Just like the players did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Bob Motley brought it to a whole nother level. You look at the photographs that we have of him making an emphatic out call. He looks like he's almost 3 feet off the ground making that call. And he's the only umpire to ever throw the late, great Buck O'Neil out of a game in its almost 7 decades involved in the game. And that night they had to sleep in the same bed together. Buck said that Bob rung him up over a disputed infield fly. And Buck believed wholeheartedly that Bob messed up the call. But that night they had to sleep in the same bed together because there weren't enough hotel rooms to go around. And as Buck would say, I turned my back to that sucker. But they were longtime friends. Bob Motley was one of the founding members of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he was known to even throw his brother out of the board meetings when we would have board meetings. And so now we're thrilled that we were able to include the umpire. He was still alive when we announced that we were going to do the statue of him. So he knew we were going to do the statue. Unfortunately, he passed away before we could get the statue installed.
Motley was awarded a Purple Heart after being shot in the foot in Okinawa during World War II. So he had seen some things and he had experienced some things. Tell me about what Hank Bayless of the Kansas City Monarchs did or tried to do to Bob Motley on the bus one day after a game.
Yeah, Hank Bayless was upset. You know, the umpires, believe it or not, folks, actually would ride on the bus with one of the teams. So you can imagine if you made what they thought was a bad call and you got to ride with them. Now, Bob was pretty smart. He would say, I would always sit at the back of the bus because he didn't want to leave his back turned to any of those guys. But Hank Bayless was particularly ticked off over a call that Bob had made and actually went after him with a machete until Buck O'Neil, who was managing the Monarchs, intervened and stopped him from hurting Bob Motley, perhaps severely.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how mad Hank was, but Buck intervened, and cooler heads thankfully prevailed.
I love that nobody asked where he got a machete.
Exactly.
We just take that part of the story for granted. Yeah, of course he had a machete. Over the years, Bob Motley umpired Ernie Banks, Willie Mays, Satchel Paige, Henry Aaron. Who did he say was the best player he ever umpired?
Willard Brown.
Tell us about Willard Brown a little bit.
Well, number one, he was nicknamed Home Run Brown by Josh Gibson. Now, if Josh Gibson nicknamed you Home Run Brown, then you probably got some power. Willard Brown was a dynamic outfielder for the Kansas City Monarchs. He also was an international star as well because he, in Puerto Rico, was as revered, particularly by the older Puerto Rican baseball fans, as much as their native son, Roberto Clemente.
Yeah.
Willard Brown won the Triple Crown in Puerto Rico twice.
Unbelievable.
His Puerto Rican home run record of 27 in 60 games still stands to this day. And in Puerto Rico, his nickname was Ese Hombre, that man. The fans would start chanting, Ese Hombre, when he came to the plate, and he seemingly always delivered. He would break the color barrier as well. Well, Hank Thompson gets to the St. Louis Browns before Willard Brown, about just a few days. Willard Brown's first appearance with the St. Louis Browns, he borrows a teammate's bat and hits a home run. When he gets back to the dugout, the white teammate broke the bat. Now, the teammate would say he was superstitious, that he didn't really like somebody using his bat, and the fact that he hit the home run with it, that was why he broke it. I think it was Willard Brown's welcome to the major leagues. And neither...
Or you're not welcome in the major leagues.
Exactly. And neither Hank Thompson or Willard Brown stuck and stayed with the St. Louis Browns. Now, I do think that the St. Louis Browns thought that both Thompson and Brown would do for them what Jackie had done for Brooklyn with black folks flooding to come see them play. The St. Louis Browns were a sideshow. both Willard Brown and Hank Thompson knew that they had left a team in the Kansas City Monarchs that were far better than the St. Louis Browns. If you were a St. Louis fan, you were a Cardinal fan. And so both got unceremoniously released. Both would come back and join the Monarchs. Hank Thompson would break the color barrier with the New York Giants. So he's there with the Giants before Willie Mays and Monty Irvin. Willard Brown would just continue his career with the Monarchs and go back to Puerto Rico and play, where he was just absolutely beloved, and it would eventually lead him into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And he, too, was in that invasion of Normandy. And he and Leon Day would play on that military team that won the championship there in Germany in the face of Hitler. And that team had a couple of other major leaguers, but it had two Hall of Famers, Leon Day and Willard Brown.
Okay, so there's still one statue we haven't talked about yet, and some listeners may think that we're talking about this one a little too late in the episode, but I personally think the subject of this statue would say we're right on time. For the coach of this legendary team, you've got Buck O'Neil, who I'm thrilled to finally be able to say was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a part of the class of 2022. John Jordan Buck O'Neil was a good player, and he was a great scout and a coach after his playing career was over, but by far the greatest impact he made was as an ambassador to the game. Being a part of the Ken Burns documentary, where he was launched into stardom, doing late-night talk show appearances on David Letterman, and all sorts of public appearances and things like that. Why was Buck the one to carry that torch?
Perhaps it was his appearance in the Ken Burns documentary, where he catapulted into national stardom. America fell in love with Buck. He was this charming, gentle man who was telling these incredible baseball stories to baseball fans that they had never heard before. And of course, he did it with a twinkle in his eye and a smile that lit up the screen. He was 82 years young at that time, and the good Lord blessed him to live another 12 years where he was literally gallivanting across this country, preaching the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of his museum to any and everybody who would listen. And for me, I was very fortunate. I guess you could say that I was hanging from the hem of his garment. And now I get to preach the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of Buck's museum to any and everybody who would listen. But Buck did come right on time, because this museum was just starting to ascend. And he became the Pied Piper, I guess you could say, of Negro Leagues Baseball. But Ken gave him a mainstream voice. As Buck would say, Bob, I've been telling these stories for 40 years and nobody ever listened. Ken Burns gave him a platform and people listened, and they never stopped listening. And he was telling these stories as faithfully as anyone could ever tell these stories. And I think the more stories he told, the deeper in love people started to fall with the Negro Leagues because of the way he told those stories. And for me, what a tremendous honor it is to have taken the baton from Buck, to share the stories that he shared with me, and to hopefully create a new generation of fans who are falling in love with the Negro Leagues through these stories. But he will forever have a place in my mind and in my heart. And we're working diligently to build Buck a new house. I oftentimes refer to this museum as the house that Buck built. I can't wait to build Buck a new house. Yeah, and we're going to do that. We're excited about our Pitch for the Future campaign and the opportunity to build a new 30-plus thousand square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that will certainly be done in Buck's memory, and his spirit will reside there just as it does here in his current home at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
Buck passed away in 2006, just a few months after learning he was not going to be inducted as a part of the 2006 Hall of Fame class. The Hall of Fame did many things in the 15 years between his passing and his eventual enshrinement to honor Buck, including the creation of the Buck O'Neil Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008. A permanent life-size bronze statue of O'Neil was dedicated in the museum that same year, accompanied by a list of award recipients and a plaque to educate museum visitors about Buck's contributions to the game. And while having a statue inside the Hall of Fame puts Buck in some elite company, joining just Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, Roberto Clemente, and Henry Aaron, the Hall kind of has an unfortunate history of inducting people after their death so they aren't around to get their flowers, despite years of people arguing on their behalf. Not just Buck O'Neil, but Minnie Minoso, Ron Santo, Dick Allen, and now the most recent example you brought up earlier of Dave Parker. Tell me what it was like for you to have to address 300 people who were gathered at the Field of Legends on the day that you found out Buck would not be inducted in 2006.
To be honest, it was probably more gut-wrenching for me to walk into this very conference room and tell my friend that he didn't get enough votes to get in. He missed by one vote.
Yeah.
And he was seated at the head of the table, right where you are now. My dear friend Joe Posnanski was on this side of the table. I go to the opposite side, and I'm trying to collect myself because I don't know how I'm going to tell him. And I finally look up at Buck and I say, well, Buck, we didn't get enough votes. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He said, well, that's how the cookie crumbles. In the next voice, he asked me how many had gotten in. I said 17. He hits the table in utter jubilation. He was excited that 17 of his colleagues had gotten their rightful place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He asked me who they were, and I didn't have that information at that point in time. And the next words that came out of his mouth, I wonder if the Hall of Fame will invite me to speak. And my dear friend Joe Posnanski, my brother from another mother, he looks at Buck, he says, Buck, you wouldn't do that, would you? And Buck says, Joe, of course I would. What has my life been about? And I say, well, Buck, I've got to go downstairs and I am going to deliver the news. As you mentioned, we had well over 300 people who had gathered for what we all thought was going to be a Hall of Fame celebration announcement. So I'll go deliver the news. I'll come back and get you because I think you should address the group. And then after that, we'll let everybody go home. It's been a long day. Well, as I so oftentimes tell that story, from this conference room downstairs to the Field of Legends was the longest walk of my life. Mm-hmm. I am literally coaching myself. Bob, you can't cry. This is your job. You got to suck it up. And the more I'm telling myself not to cry, tears were steady building in my eyes. We had the podium at second base. And this is the honest to God's truth. I have yet to go back to watch that video. I have no idea what I said that day, but whatever it was, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People were openly emotional, and this wasn't just disappointment. This was outrage. This was anger.
Right.
How dare they do this to our Buck O'Neil? And so Buck walks in through the gift shop onto the Field of Legends. And of course, the room erupts into this thunderous ovation. And he walks up to the podium, and for lack of a better term, delivered one of the most amazing concession speeches that I'd ever heard. What he did was he implored all of us not to be angry, not to be bitter, not to express any ill will toward anyone who may have had something to do with this decision. He would go on to say, I had an opportunity. And in this great country of ours, that's all you could ever ask. They didn't think old Buck was good enough. Well, we've got to live with that. But if I'm a Hall of Famer in your eyes, that's all that matters to me. Mm-hmm. Just keep on loving old Buck. Now, I'm over in the corner. I'm a wreck now. Tears are just flowing down my face. But as I remind our guests, what he did that day was he literally reached out his arms and wrapped them around all of us and said, it's okay. Mm-hmm. Instead of us consoling him, he is consoling us. And what I still say to this day, to be one of the most amazing displays of strength of character that I'd ever witnessed. He would push aside his own disappointment, go to Cooperstown, deliver this incredible speech on behalf of 17 dead folks who did not have a voice. He became their voice, and what I also say to be one of the most selfless acts in American sports history. A little over 2 months later, my dear friend Buck O'Neil passed away himself at age 94, a month shy of his 95th birthday. But as I oftentimes share with my student audience in particular, what he did that day was he taught us a tremendously valuable lesson on how to handle disappointment. Because he handled it so graciously, folk thought that maybe he wasn't disappointed. But of course he was. Mm-hmm. The Hall of Fame represents the pinnacle for any athlete, and Buck knew that he was sick at that time. He never let on to us. He never complained, not one day. But he knew he was sick, and he knew that this would be his swan song. So yes, he wanted to be there, but he was never going to be so sullen that he couldn't be genuinely joyous for those who had gotten their proper place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And after he gets into the hall 16 years after his passing, it took me a minute because I was still feeling a little salty by the fact that he had been denied that opportunity while he was alive. But after getting to Cooperstown and feeling Buck's spirit all over Cooperstown, and Joe and I rode over together, and both of us, we weren't necessarily feeling this. This was more obligatory. I needed to be there because I'm the president of the Negro Leagues Museum. And once we got to Cooperstown, and the minute we parked the car, I mean, we got bum rushed by Buck O'Neil fans, and everybody wanted to take pictures. They wanted to share their Buck O'Neil stories. They wanted to hug. And all of a sudden, that feeling of not really wanting to be there started to dissipate. And the more I thought about this, the speech that he gave in 2006 was his Hall of Fame speech.
Absolutely.
He never would have talked about himself. He would have talked about what they accomplished. And I think I allowed myself to finally accept that. And when I was able to accept that, I was able to kind of let go some of that antagonism that I think I'd been carrying for 16 years at that point in time. But yeah, it took that, and I think that realization that was his Hall of Fame speech.
You mentioned Joe Posnanski. He and Buck went on a year-long road trip to write their book, The Soul of Baseball, a road trip through Buck O'Neil's America. Joe has described Buck as having, quote, a remarkable lack of bitterness. Buck once said, in Havana, Cuba, I was a baseball player. When I got back here to America, I was a black baseball player. Can you tell me a little bit more about what exactly Buck meant when he said that, like how those differences manifested themselves?
Yeah, no, when they went to those Spanish-speaking countries, as Buck would say, they weren't black baseball players. They were just baseball players. That's all they ever wanted to be. In this country, they were looked at as being black baseball players because color was so prevalent. Everything was divided by color in this country during that time. And I think if you were to ask all of those guys who were playing in the Negro Leagues, they were playing in the Negro Leagues not because they wanted to play in the Negro Leagues. They played in the Negro Leagues because they had to play in the Negro Leagues. And they were certainly capable of playing in any league. They were good enough to play in any league, but it was just that the Negro Leagues gave them an opportunity to showcase their world-class baseball abilities. But when they went to other countries, they were experiencing liberties that they were not necessarily privy to in this country, and acceptance in those countries that they had not seen here at home.
When you think of Babe Ruth, you think of the New York Yankees. When you think of Ty Cobb, you think of the Detroit Tigers, and Ted Williams, the Boston Red Sox. But even the great Negro League players, or maybe I should say especially the great Negro League players, don't have that longevity with one team because they would be offered bigger paydays from another team, possibly in another country. And Mark Armour just recently presented research of every documented game he could find of Satchel Paige pitching. From 1926 through 1977, Mark found more than 1,800 documented games where Satchel pitched. He played for well over 100 different teams in those 1,800 games. And yes, maybe that helped more people learn about him because he was playing all over in every town of the country. But that also meant that there wasn't a singular fan base who connected with him and could call him their own, the way that Yankees fans could with Lou Gehrig. And I know this is just a product of the circumstances and that Satchel's career is an extreme example, but do you think maybe one of the reasons Negro Leaguers weren't able to break into the consciousness of the mainstream at the time was because the players just changed teams so often?
You know, I'm not sure if that's what it was, because what they did was they took the game to a lot of people who never would have seen professional baseball. Satchel going into those small towns because, you know, the Major Leagues barnstorm, but they didn't barnstorm at the level that the Negro Leagues did. And I think they actually helped grow a fan base for our game because they were
for the
taking
game
it
itself, though.
For the game itself, and maybe not necessarily for themselves,
Yeah.
unless you were Satchel.
Right.
Yeah, unless you were Satchel. Now, Satchel's a whole nother level because everybody just identified with the immense talent, the charisma that he brought to the game. Now, the other players, while they may became known in some corners of this country, probably better known when they were playing outside this country, I think that would indeed be the case. But not with Satchel. But what I admire about the fact that the Negro Leaguers were such heralded barnstormers is that they helped grow our game.
Yeah.
They gave the game to towns that would have not seen professional baseball, and their reputations preceded them.
Yeah.
We heard y'all could play. Now, we don't know about your challenges of getting here, but we expect to see what you got. And they seemingly were always able to deliver no matter what adversarial situations they had to endure to get there. And I think that's the thing that I admire about them. Once they took the field was their sanctuary. Yeah, they were going to show you that I can play this game. And fans appreciated that. So no, they won't be necessarily the household names like the Lou Gehrig's and the Babe Ruths and the Mickey Mantles because they were touted by the mainstream. It's my job now to help make them household names. That's the role of this museum.
Well, similarly, I've always kind of wondered if one of the reasons that some of these players in their stories weren't accepted or are dismissed by naysayers is because they just sound so fantastical that people assume that they weren't true. I mean, everyone thought Babe Ruth was the greatest hitter who ever lived, and he finished with 714 home runs. But Josh Gibson's supposed to have hit well over 800, with some estimates putting the number closer to 1,000 when you include exhibition games and semi-pro competitions, or Cool Papa Bell getting into bed before the light goes out, or Satchel Paige calling his fielders in after he intentionally walks the bases full and then striking out the other team's best hitter. These stories all sound unbelievable, as in not believable. Do you think that people wrote off some of these players or the Negro Leagues as a whole because they assumed that these were just tall tales? They were told with the intention of making these players seem larger than life, and it wasn't true when they are all true stories?
Well, I tell people that in the eyes of many, Babe Ruth was Paul Bunyan.
Yeah.
Well, Josh Gibson was John Henry.
Yeah.
The lore and legend has always been what has been surrounded for the Negro Leagues. And I don't want to ever lose that. I'm glad we got the stats now because baseball is a game of comparison and statistics. But you can never reduce the Negro Leagues to just statistics. I want the lore and the legend to remain there. I want these stories to remain prevalent. I want people to be able to envision the physique of Josh Gibson and how powerful he was, and the blazing speed of Cool Papa Bell, the flamboyance of a Leroy Satchel Paige. I don't want to ever lose that.
Right.
Yeah, and so I hope that remains a significant part of this story.
On June 6, 2008, Geddy Lee of the rock band Rush donated 400 autographed baseballs to the museum, which had been signed by African-American stars of the Negro Leagues. What did a donation like that mean to the museum back then?
Oh, it was tremendous. And the donation would have been significant if anybody would have delivered them. But the fact that Geddy Lee, a white Canadian rocker,
Right.
delivered that is one of the most talked about collections within our collection. And it was made even more significant by the person who delivered them. My Canadian fans will come in, and the first thing they will ask, is that the Geddy Lee?
As
Yes,
if there's
it
another
is.
one.
Exactly. Yes, it is the Geddy Lee, the former lead singer and bass guitarist of the Hall of Fame Canadian rock group Rush, delivered us one of the most significant collections of single-signed Negro League autographed baseballs anywhere in the world. And not only did he donate them, he came back and dedicated them.
Right.
So now it is tremendously significant, made even more significant by the person who donated them.
If someone listening right now has an artifact or a collection that they want to donate to your museum today, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Just contact me here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Information is on our website at nlbm.com. We are always looking for items to bring here to the museum. There are no insignificant items. Every item that we're able to bring into the fold gives us an opportunity to tell a new story. And that is so significant to us. I wish we had the big budgets like some of the other museums to go out and pursue these things, and we're competing against private collectors who have unlimited wealth. This is their business. And so we have to be a little bit more stealth-like at the things that we try to go when we do try to compete out there. But I'd say 95% of the items that are on display here at the museum were donated. They were either donated by the players or other individuals who felt like it would be better served for them to be on display here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So yes, if you have items, we would love for you to consider bringing them home to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
You're always on the go. You travel a lot. You're always at events, but you always make time to come back here and be at the museum too. Why is it still important to you that you are on the floor of the museum personally giving tours?
I couldn't imagine not doing it. I think there are a lot of people who are in my role that probably would not be as active on the floor giving tours. And it's not just for those who are distinguished guests. for me, everyone that walks through that door holds that title of being a distinguished guest. So I'll just show up on some days and I'll see people and I'll just start talking to them. I don't always tell them who I am. More times than not, I don't until we finish the tour. But I think it makes the tour even more meaningful for them to realize that the president of this museum just walked them through the museum. I saw Buck O'Neill do the exact same thing. He would sometimes sit here and people would walk by and they would do a double take. I think that's Buck O'Neill. And they look again, that is Buck O'Neill. And they would muster up the courage to go over to introduce themselves to him, and Buck would take pictures and sign things, and the next thing you know, he's walking them through the museum. And for me, man, if Buck could do it, I could do it. But, I think I get as much out of it as those who might come and visit and learn that it was the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that just escorted them to the museum. Like I said, I couldn't imagine not doing it. I enjoy it so much because I like getting an understanding and an impression for how people see the museum, how we try to interpret this story, to share the various stories that, again, that was shared with me by the likes of Buck O'Neill and Minnie Minoso and Ernie Banks and my dear friend Monty Irvin. And in doing so, I always feel like I'm keeping them alive in my mind and in my heart.
How can people follow the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum on social media and stay up to date with what's going on here?
Well, you can follow us on the World Wide Web at nlbm.com, on social media, NLB Museum KC, both X as well as Instagram, and of course, Negro Leagues Baseball Museum on our Facebook page. If you are inclined to follow me, it is NLBM Prez, Prez, on both X as well as Instagram, and just Bob Kendrick on Facebook. Mm-hmm. We'll keep you updated on everything that is happening here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
My first time here was over 10 years ago now at this point, and it is unbelievable to see the change in this museum and the artifacts and the displays in those 10 years. I can't wait to see what these next 10 years bring. Thank you so much for sitting down and taking the time. This has been one of my favorite museums in the country, baseball or otherwise. I mean, you mentioned earlier, this is not just a baseball museum. This is a civil rights museum.
Yes.
And I recommend this place so highly to everybody who's never been here. Keep doing what you're doing. It's important work.
Well, I appreciate your advocacy, and I appreciate your friendship, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
If you think this episode has been worth even $1, please click the donate button in the upper right corner of our website, shoelesspodcast.com. That is a direct link to my PayPal profile where you can make a donation in any amount. If you don't have PayPal and want to send a donation through Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, or any other platform, shoot me an email at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com and I'll send you directions for whichever method you prefer. No amount is too small. It all adds up to allow us to keep creating this content for you year after year. And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom? Where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
You went to Kansas City for a Greg Kreindler exhibit, and it was at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And you came back with pictures, and I wanted to get in the car right then with you. Seriously, I wanted to go so badly right then because I was fascinated, not only with the exhibits, but specifically with the Field of Legends, the way they set that up and the way you could walk among the statues and see these stars, these men who were the leaders of that league. Just wanted to be there. First of all, I'm a statue geek to begin with. Mm-hmm. But the way they had it set up, it was just everything. And finally, 5 years later, I got to go there with you. And that was important to go with you because that gave it a whole different perspective. And I loved every minute of it. It was even better than I imagined because it wasn't just the museum interior. It was the site where it was. It was the historic space that it was in, the historic neighborhood. It was right near the Paseo YMCA, as you talked about in the interview. I'm a Rube Foster geek. I'm a Buck O'Neill geek. and the homage that they're being paid there in that space. It meant a lot to me to walk around this place where they walked around and where they were, and kind of like being in the room. And I'm a being in the room person. And so, you mentioned about how you couldn't recommend it highly enough. I could not recommend it highly enough either. I was so thrilled we got to go, and I loved every minute of it.
Yeah, and I love the way that they kind of give you a sneak peek at the statues before you really get a good look at them. So you enter the museum and you see Buck O'Neill's statue looking at the Field of Legends through the chicken wire. Mm-hmm. But then you walk through the museum and you don't really have a good look at the field. You can kind of peek over the wall at certain points, but it's really out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
And then you're just like in the museum and you forget about it because you're looking at all of the timeline. And the way that they have that set up has been fascinating to me since the first time I was there, over a decade ago at this point, where you've got the timeline going in chronological order of here's what black people in America were allowed to do on a baseball field, and here's what black people in America were allowed to do in society. And when wartime comes up, here's what black people in America were not only allowed to, but expected to, or sometimes demanded to do on behalf of this country that didn't fight for their rights or preserve their honor in any way. Like the dichotomy that the museum displays of the treatment of black people in America over the past 200 years now, just in that museum, obviously goes back longer than that in American history, but it was a powerful thing to witness for the first time. So you walk through this heavy museum, and there are light moments. It's not a somber event the whole time. There are heavy moments for sure. But for the most part, it's like it's a baseball museum still. But then you turn the corner and the Field of Legends opens up to you, and you're like, oh yeah, all of these incredible statues of Satchel Paige and the guys that we all talked about in the interview. Like, it was just so well laid out. I'm excited for the new building to happen, but I really hope that they kind of preserve that moment. The reveal makes it so much more powerful than just walking into a room and having a bunch of statues. It was the anticipation and all of the things that come with that makes those statues so powerful in that space to me.
First of all, it's great if you can be there when no one else is there on the field with you, and it's worth it to time yourself that go look at something else. Go look at another fantastic exhibit and come back to when you can have that space, because to stand in the outfield and look in and see Josh Gibson behind the plate, that's a really, really cool perspective. Go stand next to Satchel Paige. That's all you need to do there. But you brought up where Buck O'Neill was, and I probably stood next to him. I can't tell you how many pictures I took of that Buck O'Neill statue, because it's so wistful to see him looking in and he's out. And it's heartbreaking to me that all happened. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the feeling that you get just being on that field and going from position to position, reading their plaque that's in the ground in front of them, telling you who they are and what they've done as if you didn't know already. So well thought out. And being next to a life-size figure of somebody is impactful. Takes their name off the plaque on the wall, and now you're standing next to that person.
You mentioned the trip down in 2020 for Greg's exhibit, Black Baseball in Living Color. He painted more than 200 portraits of Negro League players and black baseball and Latin baseball players all the way back to the 1800s. And the opening exhibition date was February 13th, 2020. So the 100th anniversary of the formation of Rube Foster's Negro Leagues. So that's why they picked that date. But in the back of my mind, I was like, I need to come back here and interview Bob Kendrick at some point and do this episode with him where we just tell stories about these guys. And at that point, I did have a podcast. The first episode hadn't aired yet, but I had already recorded multiple episodes, including one with Greg. That trip, I recorded another one at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum with Phil Dixon. So that was from that trip. But this would be a cool thing to talk about with somebody someday, because I've had episodes with other Negro League scholars, Phil Dixon, we just mentioned, but Larry Lester and Stephanie Liscio, where we talk about more academic approach to Negro Leagues research and history. There's another episode coming up next month. I won't say with who, but where we talk about the statistics in a more in-depth way. So I knew that this would be the perfect episode to do with Bob, where we just let him be in his element and tell the stories of these guys who, like I said at the beginning of the episode, some of the names are recognizable to everybody, but some of them are pretty obscure for people who aren't really knowledgeable about Negro League history. So it was nice to have Bob be the guy to tell those stories. So
Yeah.
all that being said, what did you think of the Bob Kendrick episode?
I loved it. I loved hearing his stories, his enthusiasm as he told the stories, his personal knowledge of some of the people, that he was in the room with Buck O'Neill. I mean, I'm kind of throwing that out as a line, but he knew who Buck was. And, you know, when he told the story about Buck not getting in 2006 into the Hall of Fame, missing the Hall by one vote, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. And hearing his, I mean, he was kind of getting choked up even telling the story. That was 20 years ago. Anyway, so his enthusiasm with the stories, the way he could weave a tale and gave you an insight that you might not get from reading a stat book. I enjoy those kinds of stories. It makes people human, and you kind of get a feel for who the person is.
Yeah, during the interview, Bob said when he first started learning about the Negro Leagues, he felt like he didn't want to keep it to himself. He said, I wanted everybody else to feel the same way about it as I did. And to me, that's what makes Bob so good at what he does. It's one thing to know these stories, but it's quite another to be able to share them in an engaging way like he does, and share them with the same enthusiasm the 1,000th time you're telling it as you did the first time you told it. You know, Bob mentioned he's been involved with the museum since 1993. So it's more than 30 years ago. If he told the Cool Papa Bell light switch story just 3 times a month since then, he has told that story over 1,000 times.
Right.
And I promise you, there have been examples in that stretch where he's told that story 3 times in a single day. So it's very likely that he has told that specific story closer to 10,000 times. And he told it here today with the enthusiasm of the first time he told it. It takes somebody special to be able to do that. You know, that was, to me, one of the hardest things about running the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. You're telling the same stories over and over and over. The guy's been dead since 1951. Nothing new has happened in his career.
Yeah.
There have been updates in the Hall of Fame candidacy or things that have happened in pop culture that, okay, we can bring new life into some of the stories. But on the field, he hasn't done anything since 1920. It's difficult to be enthusiastic day after day after day after day after day to a group of 10-year-olds who don't really know baseball history, or a group of 50-year-olds who traveled from Seattle because they're baseball geeks and they're only in Greenville to talk to me about Joe Jackson.
Right.
You have to be on your game the same way for every tour, every day.
Yeah.
And Bob has that gene. You know, like that is, I think, his greatest strength is his ability to be on. And it made this episode so easy for me to edit, not to make it sound like he's rehearsed, but he has just told these stories. I didn't need to go through and cut out a bunch of ums and uhs. He knows the words he wants to say. He said them before, and he's doing it in the same enthusiastic, engaging way. So
right. It's a smooth delivery, and he has feeling behind the words. He's not just going through the motions. Absolutely. We've both been docents, different places, but primarily with Shoeless Joe, of course. What you led with him is 30 years. I mean, even if you hold your enthusiasm for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 30 years, that speaks to his passion.
We watched a documentary on the Negro Leagues a few nights ago called There Was Always Sun Shining Someplace. And despite the fact that that movie came out in 1983 and that it was narrated by James Earl Jones, it's one that I had never heard of until a few months ago, listening to Adam Dorowski's podcast, The Outsider Baseball Notebook. Now, obviously, we all know James Earl Jones from baseball movies like Field of Dreams or The Sandlot, but in 1976, he was also in a movie called The Bingo Long Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings, co-starring alongside Billy D. Williams and Richard Pryor in a story which was loosely based on the Indianapolis Clowns barnstorming team. We talked a lot about that film during our episode with Jay Valentine, who played center field for the Clowns in 1977 and 78. But this documentary was incredible, and I'm so glad that we were able to find it. It was on Amazon Prime, so we were able to watch it. It had so many photos I'd never seen before, but also tons of video footage from the Quincy Troop archives and the Jimmy Crutchfield archives. And while it was cool to see footage of team buses driving across America, to me it was especially neat to see footage from the Caribbean and Latin America of some of these guys who I've never really seen quality game footage of. But to me, what really made it so special wasn't the archival footage. It was hearing these legends speak about their own lives and careers as older men and women, many of whose voices I'd never heard before. I tried to keep track while we watched, and these were all the names I wrote down of people who had either a talking head or voiceover spots in the movie There Was Always Sun Shining Someplace. Judy Johnson, Cool Papa Bell, Satchel Paige, Buck Leonard, Chet Brewer, Gentleman Dave Malarcher, Buck O'Neill, Dorothy Harris, who was Vic Harris's wife, Rodolfo Fernandez, Effa Manley, Jimmy Crutchfield, Monty Irvin, Willie Wells, Pat Patterson, and Ted Page. 5 of those people are ones that Bob and I covered in our discussion here today because they have statues in the Field of Legends at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City.
It was amazing to watch it. And not only the vintage footage, but watching the ones who did have an on-screen presence, seeing the relationship that they still had. They played together decades ago, and they still could rib each other, tease each other, or compliment each other. And that was kind of cute, too. You know, there were a couple of things that were really interesting. One of the things that Bob talked about was that 40% of Negro League players had some college education.
Yeah.
And in the film, one of the guys said he really thought that Jackie Robinson was the best person to break the color barrier because he was intelligent, and that's what they wanted the face that represented them to be. And he had that. It was just an interesting perspective, and Bob touched on that today.
Yeah, and when I asked him the question, how different would it have been if Satchel Paige were the guy to have broken the color barrier, Bob kind of alluded to the fact that Satchel Paige was such a well-known person already that he might not have faced the same kind of harsh treatment that Jackie did. But at the same time, Jackie was a well-known person as well. We talked about this in the Gary Sardkowski episode, that he was a phenomenal college football player before he became a baseball player. And college football in America at that point was a very popular sport. And he was on a successful UCLA football team. So his name was in newspapers. Like, people knew who Jackie Robinson was. He was not as famous as Satchel Paige, of course. But it's not like he was an unknown entity. His name was known.
Right, but Satchel Paige's name is more of a showman. You know, he's out there barnstorming all over America, so everybody's seeing him. Everybody knows his name. It's in a different perspective.
Yeah. One of the quotes during that film was a slogan that Negro League players used during World War II. If he's good enough for the Navy, he's good enough for the majors.
Right.
And I think that is kind of a point that gets driven home a lot at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as well, that if you're asking us to fight for you and die for you, we can enjoy the same luxuries and financial opportunities and career opportunities. We're just as good as you on the baseball field, if not better in many instances. Like, we belong out here. We're not asking for anything that we don't deserve. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal treatment.
Right. When I see some of the stats that the men on the Field of Legends have associated with their names, and you look at Cool Papa Bell, he played 29 summers and 21 winters. Now, take any major league player and put that against their stats. It was mind-boggling to think about that. He played from 1922 to 1950.
Yeah, there's a statistic that I think there's only 4 people in baseball history to have stolen a base in 4 different decades, but all of them have careers that spanned exactly 22 seasons. Like Ted Williams, his rookie year was 1939. He stole a base that year. His last season was 1960, so he played technically in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But he only played 1 season in the 1930s and 1 season in the 1960s. So yes, like technically that happened in 4 different decades, but it's just because his 22-year career perfectly landed within the timeline to make that happen. Cool Papa Bell played for 29 seasons.
Right.
You know, he played the majority of the 1920s, all of the 30s, all of the 40s, and then 1950s. So, like, when you look at their timeline and, like you mentioned, not just the summers, but then going to foreign countries and playing winter ball.
Right. For 21 years, not here and there.
Right.
It's just crazy. It was apparent in the film, the respect that the other players had for Cool Papa Bell. I mean, there were lots of stories about him, you know, that were funny and kind of cool. I didn't realize he had anything to do with Lou Brock, and so that was kind of cool, too. And hearing the line about when they hand Lou Brock the base, and we're going to give you this one, we figured you could steal it anyway. So
Yeah, one of the moments in the documentary that you kind of alluded to was the outfield of the 1931 to 1934 Pittsburgh Crawfords all sitting on a bench together as old men telling stories. So you've got Jimmy Crutchfield, Cool Papa Bell, and Ted Page all sitting next to each other. And Cool Papa Bell's talking about how, hey, you were a really good player. And you could just see, like, the twinkle in his eye, like, man, coming from you, that really means something.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, who are you talking about? You.
Yeah, right.
The guy's like, really? Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was cool. And that's what I mean. That documentary was cool to see that relationship, you know, that after decades of playing. Talking about Oscar Charleston, How would you like to have the three people that you're compared to be Tris Speaker, Ty Cobb, and Babe Ruth? That's a pretty good lineup for you to be measured against.
Yeah, a lot of the great Negro League players, if you ask them who is the best ball player you ever saw, a lot of their answers are either Oscar Charleston or Martin Diego. Those are the two names that over and over and over, those are the ones that come up as overall baseball players. You know, like Josh Gibson might have been a better slugger and Satchel Paige might have been a better pitcher, but when it comes to the overall talent and being a five-tool player, you know, that phrase kept coming up during this interview. And there are many great players in Negro League history, but those are the two that seem to pop up the most. They had it all.
I don't know that I've heard of too many players that are playing today that could play any position on the field except catcher.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to hear Bob talk about Leon Day in that way, and just how the committee who placed the figures on the Field of Legends, how you have to decide, okay, we have Satchel Paige, he's going to be on the mound. But what do we do with somebody like Leon Day?
Mm-hmm.
You know, he has the record for pitching in 7 of the East-West All-Star games in the Negro Leagues. He was the guy who could beat Satchel Paige.
Mm-hmm.
Another pretty good feat. And he's got to be out in right field.
Right. It was interesting to hear in the documentary again, Satchel Paige, they asked him, why did you never get tired? You know, you'd pitch 17 or 18 innings in a game, let alone the number of games that you're throwing. You know, we mentioned Mark Armour's research where he's uncovered more than 1,800. Now it's closer to 1,900 games that Satchel Paige has pitched in over the course of decades. And Satchel answered by saying,
I wouldn't get tired because I practiced every day. I had the suit on every day. Put in there 365 days out of the year, I had that baseball suit on.
And I thought it was funny that he called it a suit.
Right.
It wasn't a uniform.
Right.
It wasn't a jersey. It was his suit.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to work.
Mm-hmm.
That was the office for him. And if you want to be the best for 50 years,
yeah,
you got to treat it that way. And just that phrasing to me stood out.
Right.
That's how he looked at things.
He struck out 21 major leaguers in an exhibition game.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have enough Satchel Paige stories.
Mm-mm.
There are just so many, and you may have heard of some of them, but it's just as crazy to hear it in the retelling as it was the first time you heard it. He hears someone standing on a dugout step say something to him, and then through 9 pitches, retire the side. He could just do whatever he wanted on that field. He was in control.
There's another story that Bob didn't tell, but I've heard him tell about there was some, either a minor league ballpark or a Negro League ballpark that Satchel pitched in where there was a hole in the outfield fence slightly larger than the size of a baseball. And the owner of the stadium or the owner of the team or something, they had like a contest that if a player ever hit a ball through that hole, they'd win $100 or, $1,000, whatever an appropriate amount of money for a feat that insane would be. And everybody thought it was a bogus offer because they didn't think the hole was big enough for a ball to actually go through. So Satchel goes up, marks off 60 feet 6 inches from the fence and throws the ball, and it goes in the hole and spins around and pops back out. And the people watching are like, see, we told you that hole wasn't big enough. If Satchel can't do it, there's no way. So he goes, give it to me one more time. I got it. And the next throw goes through the hole. He's like, it was big enough. How do you put that into perspective? How do you tell that story to somebody? In one of our previous episodes, we talked about a sports writer who, at a certain point in his career, just refused to talk about Babe Ruth because he realized that nobody believed any of the stories he was telling.
Right.
I asked Bob this question during our interview. Does the fact that these stories are so fantastic detract from the true greatness of these players because people just don't believe them?
Mm-hmm.
And I liked his answer. But I do think that is a reason for a lot of people to not take the Negro Leagues as seriously until recent years, when now we are starting to uncover the actual statistics, the actual box scores. They were lost for decades, and now we're finding them as newspaper archives get digitized and things like that. But for years, you didn't have statistics to go off of. You just had these tall tales, essentially.
Right.
And do you believe that Paul Bunyan was a real guy? You know?
And I think even today, you don't have stories like that coming out of the major leagues from anybody.
Well, because everybody starts playing for their AAU teams, and their travel baseball teams by the time they're 8 years old, and everything is so regimented. And
right. You might see personality come out in some ways, but you don't see these feats, and everyone is pigeonholed into where they're going to be on the field and what they're going to do and X number of pitches, and especially with pitching, it's so controlled. And so you have a guy who's going to come in for 3 hitters and do this or whatever.
Okay, but that was your first time being at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We were driving back from the Sabre Convention in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So after having looked forward to visiting that museum for more than 5 years at that point, what sticks out to you from that visit? Whether it was the stuff surrounding the museum, being at 18th and Vine and going to the Paseo YMCA, going to the murals on the outside of that building,
Mm-hmm.
or you got to kind of hang out in the museum by yourself for a little while Bob and I were upstairs doing this interview. So when you look back, what sticks out to you about that museum?
Because I'm a history person, I enjoyed the coverage on the civil rights journey because that's interwoven, as you guys discussed earlier in the interview. The history of baseball is the history of our country as well in the civil rights fight. So there were a lot of cool artifacts that were in there related to that or different angles of it. And while I was waiting for you when you were doing the interview, I was most of the time was in the lobby area.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look out the front doors, you see this very historic street, and inside the atrium, there are the storyboards and the photographs of what this place was. And it was the center of Kansas City jazz. And so many things happened there. And the area is very well preserved. It was just a very cool space to be in. For me, inside the museum, to be standing next to Buck O'Neill and getting the perspective there, I could have just spent a lot of time. And we really did. We spent an extended period of time. We were lucky to be able to do that on the Field of Legends and just go from space to space and absorb it. When you think of what these men went through on and off the field, it was really a very cool space to be in.
Yeah, I've always liked the locker room setup that they have before you get to the Field of Legends, where you see the different authentic replicas of the uniforms that they wore matched up with the players who wore those uniforms during their career. So if a guy has been inducted into the Hall of Fame, so like Josh Gibson, for example, you see his Homestead Grays uniform there. Some of the players also have little artifacts on the shelf, so they might have a signed baseball from somebody. But between the locker room and the Field of Legends, that's where the Geddy Lee signed baseball collection is that you walk past. And it's easy to just walk past that at first because you are so excited about finally seeing these statues. But then you turn around and you're like, holy cow, there's 400 autographed baseballs here. I am not sure if it is officially the largest collection of single-sign baseballs of Negro League players to exist, but if it's not, it's got to be right up there.
Yeah.
Just an incredible gesture. First of all, whether you're going to donate or not, to put that collection together is quite an undertaking.
Right, that's a passion.
But then to look at this collection in your possession and say, like Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones, this belongs in a museum. I am getting a ton of enjoyment out of it, but I know that it is worth more to the public.
Right.
It needs to go someplace where it can be appreciated. And then to be lucky enough to have a museum that appropriately fits this collection. You know, like if you built the same collection of Latin ball players, I don't know if there is a Latin American baseball museum somewhere that can appropriately display where tens of thousands of people every year come to visit. The Negro Leagues Museum existing is part of the story also.
Right.
That Geddy Lee had this place to donate this incredible collection. Just so many things had to line up the perfect way. We're lucky to have seen it.
I've been in love with Buck O'Neill for 32 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Bob talked about how America fell in love with Buck O'Neill thanks to Ken Burns, I was already, of course, a Ken Burns fan because history.
Mm-hmm.
But when I watched baseball and there was Buck O'Neill, he just had me. I could have listened to him speak forever. He knew how to tell a tale. His kindness and his goodness just jumped off the screen, and I've really loved him ever since. It was very impactful to go see the Paseo YMCA for its history, and as you're approaching it, the way we approached it, there's this 5-story mural of Buck O'Neill on the side of that building, and it was just great. It was great to see him being honored in that way, rightfully so, when he is one of the guys who started the whole thing. It's just the perfect weaving of homage to the building and Rube Foster and the history of it. It happened there, and then he's the guy who pulls it together, and now here comes this campus encompassing all that space. You know, we touched on Bob's telling of the story of how Buck passed away before he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and he was not aware that he even made it in. Heartbreaking. I just don't, I don't really get what the accomplishment or what the goal is to have certain restrictions with the hall. It seems punitive at times when I don't think it needs to be, and just illogical sometimes. Like you interviewed Marjorie Adams, and I was with you when you did that interview. I met her. To me, it seemed like a no-brainer. I'm a historian. It's like even John Thorne is saying, her great-grandfather was the guy with the laws of baseball. She goes to the Library of Congress. There are the laws of baseball in her great-grandfather's writing, and he's not in the Hall of Fame. I don't get it. I just don't get it. When Bob told that story of how he had to break the news, and then Buck O'Neil is the guy who holds them all up, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. What are we doing? I don't get it.
Yeah, and it seemed as though the Hall of Fame kind of put in that class because Buck O'Neil had brought so much attention back to the Negro Leagues. And, this was 2006, so it had been about a decade after the Ken Burns documentary. And Buck was going on David Letterman and making the rounds and going on this road trip with Joe Posnanski and wrote a book. And, he's becoming kind of a cultural figure in his own right.
Absolutely.
And a phenomenon in his own right.
But humble.
Yeah.
Totally humble.
I don't think he was seeking it out necessarily,
no,
but people
the
realized
ambassador.
the jewel that they had in him. Like Bob mentioned, he was the last guy at that level who was still alive.
Right.
All the other all-time greats who were going to be in the Hall of Fame or eventually got in were all gone already.
Right.
So you've got this. Not only is he a great ambassador, a great storyteller, but he was a legend.
Absolutely.
And had personal connect. I mean, how many times did Bob say, oh, yeah, Buck O'Neil scouted him?
Right.
Buck O'Neil was his coach.
Right.
Buck O'Neil. So, he could talk about anybody. He'd been a baseball lifer. He was part of the game for 80 years, and he'd seen everybody. So it seemed like the Hall of Fame was kind of putting that 2006 class together as a coronation for Buck O'Neil and the Negro Leagues to be like, all right, you're the ambassador to bring it all in. And for everybody else to have gotten in and not him was, like Bob said, just heartbreaking, and it didn't make sense.
Right. Joe Posnanski said he never saw someone with such a remarkable lack of bitterness as he saw with Buck, and he knew Buck well. Buck was so gracious in that moment.
It's great that in the interim between then and Buck actually getting in, the Hall of Fame, I think, recognized their wrong and created the Buck O'Neil Lifetime Achievement Award and put his statue in the museum to honor him in a way that few others had been honored. But it is also nice that he wound up with a plaque as well. It's a shame that it didn't happen while he was alive, but for everybody else now, for the rest of time, they can go to that museum and see Buck O'Neil's face where it belongs.
It was great to see that too.
Mm-hmm. If you could spend a year going on a road trip with any baseball player, living or dead, and then at the end of that year you had to write a book about your trip together, who would you want to take that trip with?
I think I'm going to go with Christy Mathewson because he seemed like he was a stand-up guy. He seemed like he cared about other human beings. I think his head was in the right place. I think we'd have some commonality, and I think it would be a good ride.
Yeah, and he would have fun stories to tell. You could ask him all sorts of things about Charles Conlon.
Oh, yeah.
You can change your answer to Charles Conlon if you want to.
No. He could ride in the back, and he could,
photograph it?
Yes, he could document our journey.
Okay.
And it would be a photojournal, not a written book. Even better.
All right. That sounds like a good book. I'll read that. Cool. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, including daily posts detailing an important event which happened on this day in baseball history. You'll also be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. If you're a fan of some more long-form posts, you can sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. We'll also have giveaway contests that are exclusively for our newsletter subscribers, giving you even more chances to win some cool stuff. Look for a new issue to be published on the second Friday and the fourth Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Before the interview with Bob, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something, and here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter or Blue Sky at @ShoelessPodcast. Then, find the pinned post at the top of our profile with the link to the Bob Kendrick episode, which asks this episode's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in the episode that you just finished listening to. Quote that post along with your answer, and you'll automatically be entered. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win a paperback copy of John B. Holloway's incredible book, Black Diamonds, Life in the Negro Leagues from the Men Who Lived It, which is an oral history featuring interviews with a dozen former Negro Leaguers, including, among others, Chet Brewer, Willard Home Run Brown, and John Buck O'Neill. We'll reach out to the winner before the next episode of the podcast goes live. You don't have to be the first person to answer, you just have to answer correctly. But make sure you're actually following us on your preferred social media platform or your entry won't be counted. We also do a separate giveaway related to every episode through our email newsletter, and the winner of that contest gets a different prize. So make sure you're signed up for Clearing the Bases, and you'll have a chance to win something else this month too. But let's talk more about John Holloway, who I just mentioned a second ago. As Peter Warren writes, John Holloway was a pioneer in researching baseball in the Negro Leagues and Japan, which earned him acclaim as a recipient of 2 of the Society for American Baseball Research's most prestigious awards. In 2011, he won SABR's Henry Chadwick Award, which was established in November of 2009 to honor baseball's great researchers for their invaluable contributions to making baseball the game that links America's present with its past. Since 2010, when the award was given out for the first time, there have been a total of 68 historians, statisticians, analysts, and archivists who have received it, from early 20th century names like J.G. Taylor Spink and F.C. Lane, to more contemporary names like Mark Armour and Gary Asheville. Back in 1990, John Holloway also won the Bob Davids Award, which honors SABR members whose contributions to SABR and baseball reflect the ingenuity, integrity, and self-sacrifice of the founder and past president of the Society for American Baseball Research, L. Robert Bob Davids. The Bob Davids Award is considered SABR's highest honor and is awarded each year at the annual convention. It was established by the board of directors in 1985, which means that there have now been 41 recipients. Past winners of the Bob Davids Award include people ranging from Bill Nowlin, Leslie Heafy, and the official historian of Major League Baseball John Thorne, to friends of the show Stu Thornley and Larry Lester, who won it in back-to-back years in 2016 and 2017 respectively. Speaking of John Thorne though, in 2011 he wrote this: John Holloway has been researching baseball since 1944. Few, if any, may boast longer or more noteworthy contributions to baseball research. Because of Holloway, Thorne wrote, knowledge and understanding of the Negro Leagues grew exponentially. But back to Peter Warren, who writes, Holloway's contributions to Negro Leagues research were influential for generations of future scholars. His interest in black baseball began in 1945 when, as a teenager, he attended a game between the Kansas City Monarchs and the Homestead Grays at Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. Holloway recalled the matchup between 2 all-time greats in a May 2020 SABR oral history interview conducted by Bill Nowlin.
I saw a Negro League game when I was in high school in Virginia. Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. I went down to the edge of the stands to see Satchel warming up in front of his bullpen, and Josh was across the field warming up his pitcher. I have a very vivid memory that I think Satchel only pitched 2-3 innings to draw a crowd, and then a guy named Hilton Smith came in to relieve him. I remember that game pretty clearly.
That experience prompted a lifetime of research and writing. After graduating from the University of Iowa, Holloway served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. He was wounded, which earned him a Purple Heart, and was sent to Japan for the duration of his service, retiring as a colonel. He remained in Tokyo after the conflict ended, where he met Motoko Mori, and the two married in 1954. He also became a big fan of Japanese baseball while abroad. In 1954, Holloway published the first book ever written in English on the sport in Japan, called Japan is Big League in Thrills. He also wrote the first English-language book on sumo wrestling, called Sumo, in 1955 before returning to the United States. Holloway decided to write a story on slugging catcher Josh Gibson, which appeared in the Washington Post and other syndicated newspapers in 1970. He started making calls to people who knew Gibson, and soon he began traveling across the country to interview many of the then-living Negro League stars, including Satchel Paige, Buck Leonard, and Cool Papa Bell. Those interviews formed the basis of his groundbreaking 1975 book, Voices from the Great Black Baseball Leagues, which brought the history and impact of the Negro Leagues to a wider audience. From what I had stumbled on by accident was a virtually unexplored continent, he wrote in the book's introduction. The world of black baseball history was not a mere footnote to baseball history. It was fully half of baseball history. Holloway's research helped bring the stories of the Negro Leagues into the mainstream, and he continued writing articles and books on the subject for the rest of his life. His titles included The Complete Book of the Negro Leagues, Josh Gibson, Josh and Satch, and Black Diamonds, which you have a chance to win a copy of with this episode's contest. His book, Blackball Stars, Negro League Pioneers, received the 1988 Casey Award, which has been given to the best baseball book of the year every year since 1983. It was through books with John Holloway and Steve Wolf, which led to Buck O'Neill's appearance in the Ken Burns baseball documentary. The success of that documentary helped bring more attention to the Negro Leagues and to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, so it is not a stretch to say that that's one of the reasons we were able to sit here today and talk with Bob Kendrick for this interview. After 8 decades of researching, writing, documenting, and archiving, John Bartlett Holloway passed away on December 5th, 2024, at the age of 95. If you're a fan of Lawrence Ritter's brilliant book, The Glory of Their Times, or other oral history-style books like that, you are going to love the work of John Holloway. There's a very real chance that this episode doesn't exist without him. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you rate and review My Baseball History wherever you listen to the podcast. 5-star ratings help our show get featured on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means more people will have a chance to discover it. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends or family is great too. Feel free to send this episode to anyone in your life who loves baseball or loves black history and civil rights. Hopefully they'll enjoy it, and maybe they'll even learn a thing or two. But no matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.